So it seems I have a visitor this evening. Welcome. The night sky hangs clear and cold tonight, the aurora dancing green above the peaks, and I know you've come to rest beneath it. Take things slowly, and all will be well. I have some tales to share, ones that you may like. Tonight, we drift far into the past, to the First Era, the longest age Tamriel has ever recorded. Nearly 3,000 years of empires rising and crumbling, of gods walking as mortals, and of the slow turning tide between men and Mer. Settle in beneath the firs. Let the fire warm your bones. Are you all settled for this night? Good. To understand the First Era, you must first understand how the peoples of Tamriel measured time itself. An era did not close on a chosen morning or by the counting of a set span of years. An era ended when the world turned beneath the feet of those who lived in it, when a throne changed hands in a way that could never be undone, when the balance of power shifted so completely that everything afterward wore a different shape. The First Era began with the founding of a kingdom, and it ended with the murder of an emperor, and between those two moments stretched 2,920 years. No age recorded before it or after it lasted so long. Picture the world as it stood at the very start. The great continent of Tamriel held many peoples, and in those distant days the elves held nearly all the strength worth holding. In the golden isles of Somerset dwelt the Altmer, tall and long-lived. Proud of the pure blood they traced back to the ancestors who first crossed the sea. In the green tangle of Valenwood lived the Bosmer, the wood elves, hunters who kept strange pacts with the beasts and the trees. In the Ashen East, in a land then called Resdane, the Kimmer and the Dwemer shared an uneasy ground, one people worshipping their ancestors, and the other trusting only in what their hands could build and prove. And in the heartland of Cyrodiil, beneath a tower of white and gold, ruled the Aelids, the Heartland High Elves, masters of stone and magic and cruelty. Among all these elven peoples moved the scattered tribes of men. They were called the Needies, and they lived in the shadow of their masters, laboring in fields they did not own, and building cities whose halls they would never rule. In the far north, the Nords held their own ground, hard folk descended from colonists who had crossed the sea from a lost land. But even they were only beginning to press outward from their frozen holds. Men were many, yet they were bound, and the chains that held them were forged of both iron and habit. So when we speak of the First Era, we speak above all of a slow turning. At its opening, the elves stood at the height of their dominion, and men served them. By its close, men had raised empires of their own, had cast down the towers of their old masters, had made gods of themselves, and buried whole races beneath the earth. The tide that runs through these long centuries is the tide between Mer and man, rising and falling, and it carries within it every war and wonder we will speak of tonight. The records of these years are uneven, and you should know that as we begin. Some events were written down by careful hands and copied faithfully across the ages, so that we know the very year they happened. Others survive only in song, or in the boastful histories of priests who wished to flatter their own gods, or in the bitter memories of those who lost. Where the tellings disagree, and they will disagree, I will lay the differing accounts before you and let you weigh them as you drift toward sleep. That is the honest way to walk through so long an age. For this is an age crowded with marvels, and we will meet them one by one. We will stand upon a hill where a slave woman prayed to the heavens and watched a god answer her. We will walk the halls of a race of elves who vanished from the world in a single heartbeat, leaving their suppers cooling on the tables and their machines grinding on in empty rooms. We will follow the founding of the first empire, ever raised by human hands, and we will watch the covenant that bound that empire to the very gods who made the world. We will see plagues that emptied whole provinces, and beast-men who stormed cities from the sea, and a mad priesthood that tried to erase the sun and the moons from the calendar because they were too elven for its liking. And through all of it, we will hold to one thread, following the years in their proper order, from the first to the last, so that the shape of the whole age reveals itself slowly, the way a mountain range reveals itself to a traveler walking toward it through the mist. Settle deeper into the furs now, for the road is long and there is no need to hurry. We have nearly 3,000 years to cross, and we will cross them gently, resting at each landmark as we go. The fire will not go out, the night will hold, and the first landmark on our road is a kingdom in the green south, raised by a king whose name marks the very beginning of the count. To reach him, we go back to the year that scholars would ever after call the first year of the first era, when a ruler named Eplia planted a dynasty in the forests of Valenwood and set the whole long age in motion. King Eplia places a crown of polished bone upon his head and surveys the Bosmer hunters gathered beneath the massive oak branches of Valenwood. The hunters stand on the thick roots of the grat oak trees, holding bows carved from animal ribs and wearing leather armor cured in boiling tree sap. Eplia strikes the butt of his wooden spear against the packed dirt floor of the forest. He points the iron tip of the spear toward the coastal swamps in the south and the dense river valleys in the north, claiming the expanse of timber and moss for his own. Tribal leaders step forward and present him with woven vines and the carved teeth of forest predators, handing over these items to swear their allegiance to the new Camoran dynasty. This physical assembly prompts the record keepers across the continent to dip their quills into black ink and write the year 1E0 on fresh parchment pages. The Ayleid kings of Cyrodiil observe the formation of this new woodland kingdom from their balconies in the center of the continent. They sit on thrones of white marble inside the white gold tower, looking at maps drawn on stretched animal skin. The Ayleid rulers dip their fingers into colored pigments and trace thick lines across the maps, marking the Valenwood forests as a massive physical barrier separating their own jungle territories from the Altmer kingdom of Alinor in the Somerset Isles. By tracing Eplia's borders on their parchment, the Ayleids sever their long-standing trade routes and chains of command with their former masters across the ocean. Ayleid dockworkers refuse to load crates of tribute onto Altmeri galleons in the western ports, and Ayleid scribes draw heavy black lines through the names of Somerset kings in their ledgers. The White Gold Tower now stands as an independent city-state. Ayleid guards patrol the surrounding limestone walls, holding glass swords and wearing capes of spun blue silk. Glowing blue crystals sit on silver pedestals along the parapets, casting a continuous light over the central spire and the surrounding jungle canopy. As the Ayleids secure their borders, the various Aldmer-descended peoples continue to expand their physical footprint across the continent. In the Somerset Isles, the Altmer stack blocks of coral and glass to build taller towers along the coastline. In Valenwood, the Bosmer cultivate the moving grat oak trees, grafting flat wooden platforms onto the rough bark to construct their homes high in the leafy canopy. In the eastern valleys of Resdain, the Kaimer walk across the grey ash, tending herds of large insects with thick chitinous shells. Among all these elven settlements live the Nedic men. In the Cyrodiilic jungles, Nedic laborers carry heavy wicker baskets filled with quarried stone on their shoulders. Sweat drips from their foreheads and soaks into their rough-spun wool tunics. They press their calloused hands against the limestone blocks, pushing them up wooden ramps to build new temples and aqueducts. Ayleid taskmasters stand on the scaffolding above them, holding whips of braided leather and shouting commands in the Elvish tongue. The Nedic workers sleep on thin straw mats inside mud brick huts at the base of the Ayleid walls. They eat bowls of boiled grain porridge, drink water from unglazed clay pitchers, and look out through narrow windows at the towering elven architecture illuminating the night sky. In the northern snowfields, the human colonists known as the Nords build their own settlements away from the elven watchtowers. They chop down pine trees with heavy iron axes and construct longhouses with thatched roofs to block the falling snow. The Nords wear thick bear pelts and strike flint and steel to light massive fires in the stone hearths at the center of their wooden halls. They consume roasted meat, drink mead from hollowed animal horns, and sharpen their iron swords on grinding stones, looking out over the frozen tundra toward the southern valleys. Merchants and travelers move between these distinct regions, wearing paths into the dirt and paving the major routes with flat cobblestones. Carts with wooden wheels roll across these roads, carrying crates of dried meat, bundles of iron ore, and sacks of harvested grain. Elven merchants exchange silver coins for uncut gems and bolts of woven cloth in the open-air markets. Magic permeates the streets and courtyards of the elven cities. Ayleid sorcerers read scrolls of dried parchment under the light of Welkin stones, studying the movements of the stars through telescopes of polished brass and cut glass. Mages in silk robes press their hands against standing stones, watching blue sparks arc between their fingertips. While the mainland empires draw new borders and construct taller towers of stone and glass, a different group gathers on an island across the sea. Monks in grey robes stand on the rocky shores of the Isle of Artaeum, watching the ocean waves crash against the stone cliffs. A Breton sage named Voanette steps into a small wooden boat and rows across the water toward this secluded island, holding a rolled parchment in his hand to record the practices of these mystics. In the 20th year of the First Era, salt water splashes against the wooden hull of a small rowboat. A Breton sage named Voanette grips 2 wooden oars, pulling them back through the cold water of the Abatian Sea. Thick grey fog rests heavy over the ocean surface, coating Voanette's wool tunic in tiny drops of moisture. He rows past jagged rocks covered in green kelp, and as the fog breaks, the Isle of Artaeum appears ahead of him. The island consists of high limestone cliffs and rolling hills covered in pale green grass. Trees with silver leaves catch the sunlight, and bright blue flowers grow in thick patches along the dirt paths. Voanette pulls his rowboat onto a beach of crushed white shells. Monks wearing plain grey robes stand on the shore, gesturing for the Breton sage to follow them up a winding trail of smooth, flat stepping stones. Voanette carries a leather satchel filled with fresh parchment and sticks of black charcoal. He walks behind the monks, recording the physical details of the island and the people who inhabit it. These monks call themselves the Psijic Order. The path leads to the center of the island, where Sephora Tower rises above the tree canopy. The tower consists of coral and smooth, pearl-colored stone layered in a massive spiral. The monks walk with bare feet across the polished marble floors inside the central hall. They place dried animal bones, polished river stones, and dyed sands on low wooden tables, arranging them into precise geometric shapes. They burn bundles of dried sage and sweetgrass in bronze bowls, filling the air with thick, fragrant smoke. They call this physical practice the old ways. Through this practice, the monks observe the physical world and the weather patterns passing over the continent. They pour spring water into silver basins and watch the ripples form on the surface. They track the changing positions of the stars by turning massive brass armillary spheres covered in etched constellations. They grind dried roots and glowing blue mushroom caps in stone mortars, mixing the powder with water to create glowing elixirs. In the highest room of Seppara Tower, Vornet meets Iacasis, the Rite Master of the Psijic Order. Iacasis is an Altmer of great height, wearing layered robes of grey silk and woven gold thread. He holds a staff of polished white driftwood, topped with a large, staring eye carved from lapis lazuli. Iacasis pours steaming tea from a brass kettle into 2 small clay cups, placing one in front of Vornet on a carved wooden desk. Vornet unrolls a sheet of parchment and presses his charcoal against the paper. He records the daily lives of the Psijic Order, sketching the shapes of their brass instruments and writing down the ingredients they use in their bronze mortars. The Breton sage dips his charcoal into water and traces the deep grooves etched into the pearl-colored stone walls of the tower, copying the ancient runes onto his parchment. He catalogues the physical artifacts stored in the lower chambers, running his hands over the smooth surfaces of polished obsidian mirrors and tall stacks of cured leather codices. He watches the monks load heavy leather-bound books onto wooden carts, pushing them down stone ramps into deep subterranean vaults below the tower. In these underground rooms, the monks slide rolled scrolls into sealed bronze tubes and stack them on iron shelves, preserving the knowledge of the continent. The monks of Artium also travel across the sea to the mainland. They walk into the throne rooms of elven kings in the Somerset Isles and the Valenwood forests. They stand beside the high thrones of glass and carved bone, leaning down to speak directly into the ears of the rulers. They point to specific clauses in trade treaties and draw lines on military maps, guiding the decisions of the elven monarchs through spoken counsel. They leave the throne rooms and sail back to their secluded island, returning to their brass spheres and silver basins of water. Vornet binds his charcoal sketches and written notes into a leather folder. He documents this 20th year of the First Era, establishing the Psijic Order as the earliest recorded lawmasters on the continent of Tamriel. The monks continue to burn their sweetgrass and chart the stars in the warm air of the Southern Ocean. Far to the north of this tropical island, thick layers of white frost coat the wooden palisades of human settlements. Snow falls continuously over the jagged mountain peaks and accumulates on the thatched roofs of the longhouses. Inside the warm halls, the Nords strap plates of heavy iron armor over their chests and forearms. They pull thick, bare fur cloaks around their shoulders and grip the leather-wrapped handles of broad steel axes. They step out of their wooden doorways, their boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. They look out over the frozen tundra, form into long marching columns, and begin walking south toward the warmer valleys to expand the borders of their territory. The boots of the Nordic warriors crunch through the thick crust of the northern snowfields. They march in long columns down the steep slopes of the Geral Mountains and the Velothi Mountains, leaving deep tracks in the white powder. These men and women trace their bloodlines back to Ysgramor and the original colonists from across the northern sea. They inhabit the region known as Skyrim, constructing massive stone keeps and driving thick pine logs into the frozen earth to form high palisades. Inside these walled cities, Jarls sit on heavy oak chairs, draped in wolf pelts. They wear circlets of hammered iron on their heads and drink hot mead from carved wooden tankards. The Nords carve the faces of hawks, bears, and dragons into the timber pillars of their mead halls, striking iron tools against the wood to shape the rough features. Smoke from the central hearths rises through holes in the thatched roofs, carrying the scent of roasting venison and charred pine out into the freezing air. Blacksmiths plunge glowing iron blades into barrels of cold water, producing thick clouds of white steam. As the population of Skyrim increases, the Jarls point their iron swords toward the eastern borders. The warriors strap circular shields of oak and iron to their backs and secure thick leather boots with rawhide laces. They carry broad battle axes and long spears with leaf-shaped steel heads. The marching columns traverse the high mountain passes, navigating through narrow ravines of grey granite and loose shale. They push through the high snowdrifts, wrapping their fur cloaks tightly around their necks to block the biting wind. They cross the border into the eastern province of Resdayn, bringing their weapons and heavy armor into a land defined by volcanic rock and falling ash. The terrain changes from white snow to fields of grey powder. Large mushrooms with thick, fibrous stalks grow in the river valleys, and jagged spires of basalt pierce the sky. Two distinct elven races inhabit this ash-covered region. The Kimmer wear armor crafted from the polished shells of giant insects and carry curved swords made of bone and hardened resin. They track the wild netch herds through the fungal forests and build their settlements using heavy animal hides stretched over frames of giant rib bones. They cover their skin in colored ash and dye, standing motionless among the tall mushroom stalks to watch the mountain passes. Deep below the surface of Resdayn, the Dwemer extract metal ores from the volcanic rock. They heat the ore in massive stone crucibles and pour the molten bronze into molds. The Dwemer construct subterranean halls lit by glowing crystals and build large brass gates that vent clouds of pressurized steam out onto the ashen plains. They assemble mechanical spiders and rolling spheres from brass gears and copper pipes, placing soul gems inside the metal frames to power the spinning joints. The Nords press into this unfamiliar landscape. They blow into massive war horns carved from mammoth tusks, sending low, vibrating blasts across the volcanic valleys. The Chimer warriors form defensive lines along the ridges, gripping their chitin swords and raising shields of layered insect shell. The Dwemer remain behind their heavy brass doors, pulling large iron levers to seal their underground fortresses against the incoming armies. The iron axes of the Nords strike the bone shields of the Chimer. Steel blades cut through the leather armor and the insect plates. The Nords use their heavy boots to push the Chimer lines backward, advancing foot by foot across the ash fields. They chop down the giant mushrooms with their axes and clear wide circles of land. The Nords drag blocks of dark basalt from the quarries and stack them to build large, square keeps. They light fires on the flat roofs of these new stone fortresses, establishing physical dominion over the territory of Resdayn. The Nordic occupation spreads across the eastern province. The human warriors patrol the ash roads, holding their spears upright and demanding sacks of grain and bundles of uncut gems from the Chimer settlements. They stack these tribute items onto wooden carts and pull them back to the newly built stone forts. The Chimer retreat into the deep ravines and the remote coastal islands, watching the human patrols from behind the cover of jagged rocks. The Dwemer stay in their deep tunnels, striking their bronze anvils and watching the human movements through periscopes of cut glass pushed up through the soil. The Nords stand on the high walls of their basalt forts, looking out over the conquered valleys and resting their hands on the pommels of their swords. The Nordic kings send messengers back to the snowy halls of Skyrim, carrying scrolls wrapped in leather tubes. The scribes unroll these scrolls on the oak tables and record the expansion of the kingdom. The Nords hold the elves of Resdayn under the edges of their steel axes. They turn their gaze toward the south, looking past the Geralt Mountains toward the center of the continent. In the humid jungles of Cyrodiil, the Ayleids maintain their hold on the Nedic tribes. The jungle air remains thick with moisture and the buzzing of cicadas. The elven kings wear crowns of colorful bird feathers and sit on cushions of woven silk, eating fresh fruit from silver platters. They stand on their white marble balconies, detached from the Nordic conquests in the north and the east. They grip their leather whips and watch the human slaves pull blocks of limestone through the mud. The Nidaes push their bare feet into the wet earth and strain their muscles against the heavy iron chains. They look up at the towering white spires of the elven cities, wiping the sweat and dirt from their faces. The heavy stones scrape against the wooden ramps, and the blue crystals glow steadily above the Cyrodiilic canopy. The Ayleid sorcerer kings walk across the high bridges of the white gold tower, wearing cloaks woven from the brightly colored feathers of tropical birds. They look down upon the sprawling city of Cyrod, where elevated aqueducts carry clear river water into marble bathhouses, and glowing blue Welkin stones illuminate the broad avenues. The elven lords hold staves of meteoric iron and cast spells of levitation to place massive blocks of white limestone atop high columns. Even as they wield this powerful magic, they command the human tribes of the Nidaes to perform the most grueling physical labor in the humid jungle heat. Nedic men and women push wooden carts filled with quarried stone through the thick mud. Heavy iron collars encircle their necks, and thick chains connect them in long lines. The iron chafes their skin, leaving thick red scabs and open wounds across their collarbones. When a human stumbles and drops a rope, an Ayleid taskmaster, standing on a wooden scaffold, cracks a braided leather whip across the worker's back, tearing the wool tunic and drawing lines of fresh blood. The humans press their calloused hands into the dirt, push themselves back up, and throw their weight against the wooden wheels of the carts. While the human slaves drag the stones to build the city, the Ayleid kings descend into subterranean chambers beneath their marble palaces to conduct rituals. The elven sorcerers draw intricate geometric circles on the polished stone floors using crushed bone and powdered ruby. They chant in the Aldmeri tongue and pour bowls of human blood onto burning braziers. In response to these actions, portals of swirling purple energy tear open in the center of the rooms. Daedric entities step out of the portals from the realms of oblivion, sporting curved horns, leathery wings, and armor made of blackened metal. The Ayleid kings hand screaming Nedic captives over to these Daedric creatures and receive enchanted weapons, dark spells, and long lifespans in return. By making these pacts with the Daedric princes, the Ayleid society shifts its practices toward elaborate displays of physical torture. In the city of Sardavar Lied, elven artisans practice the craft of flesh sculpting upon their human captives. The elves secure Nedic slaves to iron tables and use long silver knives to cut away the skin. They stretch the exposed muscle and sinew over wooden frames, using small metal hooks and copper wire to hold the living humans in new, agonizing postures. The Ayleid lords walk through these galleries of exposed muscle, drinking wine from silver goblets and examining the precise cuts. In the city of Cyrodiil, Iliad priests create sprawling organic displays known as gut gardens. They slice open the abdomens of Nedic slaves and pull out the intestines, burying the wet organs in the soil while the victims remain chained to wooden stakes. The priests pour glowing green potions over the soil, causing the flesh to mutate and grow into writhing, pulsing shapes that decorate the courtyards. At the Temple of the Ancestors, the elves chain human children to heavy iron grates above deep fire pits. The Aelids ignite piles of dry wood beneath the grates, setting the captives on fire and using the intense heat to warm the stone floors of the adjacent elven bathhouses. The smell of burning hair and charred meat drifts through the city streets, and thick black smoke rises from the temple chimneys to stain the blue sky. In other arenas, the elven masters release starved tigers into enclosed sand pits with unarmed Nedic families, sitting on shaded bleachers and placing wagers of gold coins on how long the humans will survive the tearing claws and sharp teeth of the beasts. At night, the Iliad guards lock the surviving Nedes inside cramped iron cages at the base of the city walls. The human slaves sit on damp straw, shivering in the cool night air. They pack wet mud into the bleeding whiplashes on their backs and wrap torn rags around their blistered hands. They eat the discarded scraps of rotten fruit and gnaw on the boiled animal bones thrown into the pens by the elven cooks. The iron chains rattle as the slaves shift their weight on the hard stone floors. Despite the heavy iron collars and the constant crack of the leather whips, the humans whisper to each other in the dark. They pass small carved wooden totems of hawks, wolves, and moths through the iron bars, hiding the idols in the straw before the elven guards walk past with their torches. They point to the stars shining above the Cyrodiilic canopy and share stories of the winged gods of the sky. In a muddy holding pen on a high hill in Sardavar Lead, a female slave kneels on the cold ground. Dirt covers her cheeks, and thick pink scars run across her shoulders. She grips a small wooden carving of a hawk in her bruised hands, pressing the rough wood against her chest. She tilts her head back, fixes her eyes on the bright stars shining through the gaps in the jungle canopy, and moves her dry lips to send a quiet string of words up into the night sky. In the year the scribes record as 1E242, the slave woman named Alessia walks away from the muddy holding pens of Sardavar Lead. She climbs the steep incline of a rocky hill, pressing her bare feet into the loose shale and the damp earth. The wind blows through her matted black hair and chills the sweat on her neck. She reaches the flat summit, a high plateau where the stone fortresses of Sancre Tor will stand in later centuries. Alessia drops to her knees in the wet grass, holding the small wooden hawk totem in her hands and squeezing the carved wings until the rough wood digs into her palms. She tilts her head back, opens her mouth, and speaks words directly to the bright stars. She asks the sky for steel swords, for heavy shields, and for the physical strength to crush the Aeliad kings. The clouds above the Cyrodiilic jungle part in response to her voice. The air pressure drops, popping the ears of the woman kneeling on the hill as a column of blinding white light bursts from the night sky. The light strikes the top of the plateau, scorching the green grass into black ash and filling the air with the smell of ozone and burning soil. Two massive figures step out of this brilliant light, their heavy feet striking the ground and sending deep vibrations through the dirt. The 8 divines of the sky hear the words spoken by the human slave and send these physical avatars down to the earth to aid her. The first figure to step out of the light is Morihaus. He stands on 2 thick legs, ending in heavy, cloven hooves, that press deep into the soil. A thick coat of coarse black hair covers his massive, barrel-shaped chest and muscular arms. His head is that of a giant bull, featuring a wide snout, flared nostrils, and two massive ivory horns curving upward from his skull. Heavy rings of hammered gold pierce his septum, and he exhales forcefully, blowing thick clouds of white vapor from his lungs into the cool night air. He carries a massive iron hammer with a handle thicker than a man's thigh. Morihaus lowers his heavy head, plants the head of his hammer into the dirt, and kneels before Alessia, offering his immense physical bulk to her command. The second figure steps forward next to the man-bull. He is a tall, broad-shouldered warrior named Pellinal Whitestrake. Interlocking plates of polished white star metal cover his entire body, reflecting the moonlight in bright flashes. A thick, angular helmet encases his head, featuring a narrow horizontal slit for his eyes. Deep within his chest cavity, beneath the white armor, a red diamond rests in the center of his rib cage. The gem emits a continuous, pulsing crimson light that bleeds through the gaps in his breastplate. Pellinal holds a heavy, spiked mace in his right hand and a broad kite shield in his left. The metal joints of his armor grind and click together as he moves. He raises his mace toward the white gold tower in the distance, striking the steel head against his shield and producing a deafening metallic clang that echoes down the hillside. Alessia stands up from the wet grass and walks back down the hill with the man-bull and the armored knight flanking her. As the trio enters the slave camps at the edges of the Ayleid settlements, the Nedic workers drop their wicker baskets and look up at the towering figures. Morihaus walks up to the human laborers, raises his massive iron hammer, and strikes the heavy iron chains connecting their collars. The iron links shatter into sharp, jagged fragments, falling away into the mud. Pellinal Whitestrake pries open heavy iron crates from the Ayleid armories and hands steel longswords and iron-tipped spears to the Nedic men and women. The Nedes grab the weapons and wrap their blistered hands around the leather grips of the steel swords. Workers holding farming tools grasp their heavy iron mining picks, their sharp logging axes, and their wooden pitchforks. They tear long strips of cloth from the hems of their wool tunics and wrap the fabric tightly around the wooden handles to absorb the sweat from their palms. They pull the loose iron collars off their necks and drop them into the dirt, stepping heavily on the metal rings with their muddy boots to grind them into the earth. Thousands of Nedic laborers gather in the clearing outside the elven estates. They dip the ends of pine branches into barrels of thick black pitch and hold the wood over the campfires. The pitch ignites, producing bright orange flames and thick trails of black smoke. The humans hold the burning torches high above their heads, illuminating their scarred faces and the sharp edges of their newly acquired weapons. The scent of burning pine resin and unwashed wool fills the humid jungle air as the human laborers form massive columns, standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud. Alessia steps to the front of the crowd, holding a bright steel sword in her right hand and pointing the sharp tip toward the sprawling palaces of the Ayleid kings. The human army steps forward in perfect unison, their boots splashing into the wet earth and their weapons clattering against one another. Beside Alessia, the armored warrior known as Pellinal Whitestrake tightens his silver gauntlets around the leather grip of his mace. He rolls his shoulders, stares through the narrow slit of his helmet at the elven guards waiting in the valleys ahead, and prepares to break the sorcerer kings into pieces. Pellinal Whitestrake leads the human rebellion out of the southern slave camps, walking ahead of the columns of Nedic workers. He carries his heavy spiked mace and his broad kite shield, his boots sinking into the wet mud. When the Ayleid armies form lines of spearmen across the jungle clearings, Morihaus and Alessia direct the human forces to clash against them. The Nedis push forward with their stolen steel swords and pitch-soaked torches, fighting the elven guards in the thick undergrowth. But Pellinal does not stay with the main army. He breaks away from the human columns and walks directly toward the white marble palaces, seeking out the Ayleid sorcerer kings in single combat. At the elven estate of Copper and Tea, the sorcerer king Haromir stands on a high stone balcony. He wears robes of woven silk and holds a staff of meteoric iron, preparing to cast spells of destruction down upon the approaching rebels. Pellinal walks through the outer courtyards, shattering the limestone statues with his mace and knocking the bronze braziers to the ground. He reaches the balcony, raises his weapon, and brings the spiked steel head down onto Haromir, crushing the elven king's skull against the marble floor. At the fortress of Ninendava, Gordhar the Shaper commands a garrison of Ayleid soldiers. Gordhar wears armor of molded glass and commands Daedric beasts summoned from oblivion. Pellinal breaks down the heavy wooden doors of the fortress, stepping over the splintered timber. He strikes the Daedric creatures with his mace, turning them into piles of black ash, and drives his shield into Gordhar's chest. He pins the Shaper to the stone wall and crushes his body with repeated blows from his weapon. At the city of Seatatar, the Fire King Hadhul waits in a courtyard illuminated by burning pits of oil. Hadhul casts spheres of intense heat from his hands, scorching the grass and melting the iron weapons of the Nedic slaves. Pellinal walks straight through the flames, the fire washing over his white star-metal armor without leaving a mark. He raises his mace, strikes Hadhul, and leaves the Fire King dead on the heated stone tiles. Pellinal repeats these actions across the Cyrodiilic heartland, moving from one Ayleid settlement to the next. He clears the southern roads of elven patrols, allowing Alessia and Morihaus to establish fortified camps and arm more human slaves. A young Nedic hoplite named Huna fights alongside Pellinal in these skirmishes. Huna carries a spear with a heavy iron tip and stays close to the armored knight, thrusting his weapon at the Ayleid soldiers who try to flank them. During a battle near the eastern riverbanks, an Ayleid archer fires a glass-tipped arrow. The arrow pierces Huna's neck, and the young hoplite collapses into the mud. Pellinal watches his companion die on the ground. The red diamond in Pellinal's chest begins to pulse rapidly, casting a bright crimson light through the gaps in his armor. Pellinal drops his shield and tightens his grip on his mace. He walks into the closest Ayleid city and begins swinging his weapon at every elven structure and person he sees. He shatters the white columns, collapses the marble roofs, and strikes the elven citizens until their bodies are unrecognizable. He moves to the next city, and then the next, his armor coated in thick layers of elven blood. He destroys the city of Narlame, leaving the buildings in piles of broken rubble. He walks to the city of Celadiel and tears down the stone walls, crushing the elven priests in their own gut gardens. The Nedders and the Ayleids both run from Pellinal as he marches across the landscape. The red light from his chest illuminates the jungle canopy at night, and the sound of his mace striking stone echoes for miles. He clears large tracts of land, entirely removing the Ayleid populations from the eastern territories. His continuous destruction pushes the remaining Ayleid kings to abandon their outer estates. The surviving elven lords gather their remaining forces and retreat toward the center of the continent, fortifying their positions behind the massive limestone walls of the White Gold Tower. They sit on their thrones, listening to the reports of the destroyed cities, and look for a way to stop the armored knight walking toward their gates. The Ayleid kings do not wait quietly behind their walls. They look out from the high balconies of the white gold tower, watching the black smoke rise from their ruined outer cities. The elven lords gather in the central throne room, unrolling ancient scrolls of Daedric pacts upon the white marble tables. Since their own magic and soldiers fail to stop Pelennor Whitestrake, the kings call upon the Daedric prince Meridia for a champion. Meridia responds by sending Umaril the Unfeathered down to the physical plane. Umaril steps into the central courtyard of the Ayleid capital. He possesses an elven physical form, but stands several feet taller than the Ayleid kings. Thick plates of golden armor cover his torso and limbs, catching the light from the blue Welkin stones. He holds a massive longsword forged from yellow meteoric glass. Umaril bears the title of demigod, possessing a lifespan tied to the Daedric realms. The Ayleid kings place a crown of white feathers and gold upon his head, and point him toward the eastern valleys, where Pelennor crushes their stone fortresses. The two heavily armored champions walk toward each other across the Nibelheim Valley. The human army of Nedic slaves halts their advance, dropping their torches and lowering their stolen steel swords. They stand in the mud, watching the white star metal armor of Pelennor approach the yellow glass armor of Umaril. The two titans swing their massive weapons. Pellennor's spiked mace strikes Umaril's golden breastplate, leaving deep dents in the metal and sending loud clangs echoing over the riverbanks. Umaril swings his glass sword, dragging the sharp edge across Pellennor's kite shield and showering the dirt with bright yellow sparks. The ground beneath their boots turns to deep mud as they shift their weight, tearing up the roots of the jungle trees. Pelennor presses his attack, driving his shield into Umaril's chest and pushing the elven champion backward. The White Knight swings his mace in wide arcs, breaking Umaril's guard and shattering the glass blade. Pelennor strikes a final heavy blow, crushing Umaril's helmet and leaving the Daedric champion dead on the muddy riverbank. Despite his physical death on Nirn, Umaril's spirit detaches from his broken body and escapes into the waters of oblivion, preserving his existence in the Daedric realms. Pelennor stands over the crushed golden armor, breathing heavily through the slit in his helmet. The red diamond in his chest pulses rapidly. Pelennor looks up at the remaining Ayleid kings standing on the balconies of the white gold tower. The White Knight raises his mace and begins marching directly toward the thick limestone walls of the elven capital. The human rebellion follows him. Alessia and Morihaus lead the Nedic columns across the river, pulling heavy wooden siege ladders through the water. They drag carts filled with iron-tipped arrows and sharpened spears onto the eastern shores. The Needies construct crude wooden battering rams from the trunks of fallen jungle trees, binding the wood with thick ropes of braided vines. The Ayleid kings realize the human army now surrounds their final stronghold. The elven lords seal the massive bronze gates of the white gold tower and position archers along the high parapets. The Ayleid sorcerers stand on the walls, holding staves of meteoric iron and casting spells of fire and lightning down upon the approaching human slaves. Pelennor walks through the spellfire, his white armor deflecting the blasts of heat. He approaches the heavy bronze doors, raises his spiked mace, and begins striking the metal. Before the human army can breach the outer walls, the Ayleid kings agree on a desperate tactic to stop Pelennor. They wait for the armored knight to push through the splintered bronze doors and enter the inner courtyards. As Pelennor steps onto the polished marble floors, the elven sorcerers trigger a series of powerful magical traps hidden beneath the paving stones. Beams of intense magical energy erupt from the floor, striking Pellinal and holding his limbs in place. The Ayleid kings surround him, drawing blades of sharp volcanic glass. They drive their glass swords into the gaps of Pellinal's star metal armor. They cut the leather straps holding his breastplate in place and pry the thick white plates off his body. The elves strike the red diamond in his chest, shattering the gem into sharp red fragments. They sever his limbs from his torso with heavy axes and cut off his head, throwing the pieces of his body down the marble steps of the white gold tower. The Ayleids leave Pellinal's severed head lying in the dust at the base of the steps. The human army watches their champion fall, but they do not retreat. Morihaus lets out a massive roar from his bull snout, shaking the ground and rattling the glass windows of the elven palaces. The Nedic slaves surge forward, lifting their wooden battering rams and rushing the broken bronze gates. Alessia holds her steel sword high, leading the human wave directly into the heart of the Ayleid capital. In the year 1E243, the heavy bronze gates of the white gold tower crash backward onto the polished marble floors. The Nedic slaves pour through the broken entryway, holding their bloody steel swords and pitch-soaked torches. They wear ragged wool tunics stained with mud and ash, pressing into the immaculate courtyards built by their elven masters. Alessia walks at the front of the human column, her sword drawn. Morihaus marches beside her, his hooves cracking the pristine stone tiles, and his bull snout exhaling thick clouds of vapor. The human rebels corner the surviving Ayleid guards against the limestone walls, striking them down and pulling the bright bird feather cloaks from their shoulders. The white gold tower falls, and with it, the Ayleid Empire collapses into the dirt. The human slaves walk through the high corridors, looking at the glowing blue Welkin stones and the statues carved from meteoric glass. They enter the central throne room, where Alessia climbs the shallow marble steps and sits upon the seat previously occupied by the elven sorcerer kings. She issues decrees that establish the Alessian Empire, the very first empire ruled by human hands on the continent of Tamriel. The record keepers document this moment as the sharpest turn in the long era, marking the precise point where political dominance shifts from the elven races to the human tribes. Outside the city walls, thousands of Ayleids run through the dense jungle undergrowth. They discard their heavy glass armor and silk robes, moving as quickly as possible through the thick ferns and hanging vines. They cross the southern borders into Valenwood, seeking refuge within the Camoran dynasty established by King Aplir. The Bosmer hunters allow these fleeing Ayleids to enter the forests, granting them spaces to build smaller stone settlements beneath the canopy of the walking grat oak trees. However, Alessia does not order the death of every elven citizen within Cyrodiil. During the rebellion, several Ayleid lords had refused to ally with Umaril, the Unfeathered or the Sorcerer Kings, choosing instead to assist the Nedic slaves by supplying them with iron weapons and mapping out the locations of the magical traps. Alessia honors these alliances, permitting these specific Ayleid families to retain their physical estates and agricultural lands. The surviving Ayleid lords kneel before the human empress, swearing oaths of fealty and offering chests of silver coins and cut gems as tribute. The new Alessian Empire takes shape within the walls of the conquered city. Human masons use iron chisels to scrape the elven runes off the limestone columns, carving out the geometric circles and Daedric symbols. They replace these carvings with the shapes of wolves, hawks, and the great bull. Nedic citizens walk freely through the wide avenues, carrying woven baskets filled with fresh fruit and baked bread. They draw water from the elevated aqueducts without wearing heavy iron collars, and they sleep on woven mats inside the stone houses formerly occupied by Aelid merchants. To govern this new society, Alessia calls meetings in the central throne room. She sits on the high seat, surrounded by Nedic warlords holding steel axes, Nordic jarls wearing heavy bear pelts, and Aelid lords draped in plain linen cloaks. The Empress listens to the varying languages and observes the different styles of armor, recognizing the need to bind these distinct groups together under a single set of laws. The Nords in the room strike their iron axes against the floor, demanding the destruction of all remaining elven architecture and the implementation of their northern pantheon of animal gods. The Aelid lords grip the edges of their wooden chairs, arguing for the preservation of their magical institutions and their worship of the ancient elven ancestors. Alessia raises her hand, commanding silence in the hall. She points toward the tall windows of the white gold tower, directing the attention of the squabbling leaders toward the sky outside. The Empress knows that physical laws and steel swords alone will not hold this fractured empire together. She must establish a higher authority to maintain the newly drawn borders. Alessia walks out of the white gold tower and stands on the cracked marble tiles of the central courtyard. A shadow passes over the city as a massive dragon descends from the clouds. His heavy scales feature the color of hammered gold, and his wings span the entire width of the plaza. The dragon lands on the stone, his curved talons cracking the limestone pavers and sending chips of rock flying into the air. He lowers his large reptilian head until his snout rests directly in front of the human Empress. The dragon opens his jaws and drops a heavy chain of linked gold into Alessia's open palms. At the center of the metal chain rests a massive, kite-shaped red diamond. The gemstone emits a bright, pulsing crimson light that reflects off Alessia's skin and casts long shadows across the ruined courtyard. Alessia lifts the heavy gold chain and places it around her neck, letting the red diamond rest against her collarbone. She turns and walks toward a large bronze brazier situated in the center of the temple district. As she approaches the unlit coals, the gem flares with intense heat. A towering column of bright orange fire erupts from the bronze basin, shooting hundreds of feet into the sky. Across the continent of Tamriel, the swirling purple portals of oblivion snap shut. The Daedric beasts, summoned by the Aelid sorcerers, vanish in flashes of blue light, leaving behind only scorch marks on the grass and the smell of sulfur. The orange flame in the brazier burns steadily, and the air above the city ripples with a visible distortion. The scribes sit on wooden stools and record this event on fresh parchment, writing down the specific condition that the fires will continue to burn as long as the descendants of Alessia wear the red diamond and sit upon the central throne. Alessia returns to her chambers and gathers the religious leaders of her new empire around a long oak table. She places wooden totems of the Nordic animal gods next to the polished marble statues of the elven ancestors. She points at a wooden carved hawk, picks up an elven glass carving of an eagle, and pushes the two objects together in the center of the table. She instructs the scribes to dip their quills into black ink and write a single new name on the parchment, combining the separate deities into one unified list. The scribes scratch their quills across the pages and write out 8 specific names, cementing a new imperial religion through ink and paper. The priests take these copied scrolls into the city streets, reading the 8 names aloud to the crowds of humans and elves. Workers construct new temples from quarried limestone, placing 8 bronze braziers in a circle around the central stone altars. The crowds filling the capital city feature new shapes and colors, Nedic farmers wearing rough wool tunics walk alongside Aliad merchants draped in blue silk robes. They step over the same cobblestones and exchange silver coins for braided loaves of bread, dried river fish, and clay jugs of wine at the same wooden market stalls. Nordic warriors from Skyrim enter the southern city, wearing their heavy bear pelts and carrying broad iron battle axes on their backs. They drink fermented mead from carved horns in the taverns, sitting across from tall minotaurs with thick brown fur and brass rings pierced through their wide snouts. The minotaurs swing heavy iron hammers to repair the broken stone walls, working directly next to human masons and elven architects. Words of Aldmeri, Nordic, and Nedic tongues blend together in the humid air under the light of the burning orange dragonfires. Decades pass, and the scribes continue to fill their ledgers with the daily records of the empire. Alessia lies on a low wooden bed inside the imperial chambers, her hair completely white and deep wrinkles lining her face. She breathes in short, shallow gasps. Mori House kneels beside the bed, his massive bull head bowed, and clear tears run down his furred snout onto the stone floor. Alessia closes her eyes, and her chest stops moving. The massive red diamond around her neck glows with a sudden, blinding brilliance. A thick white mist rises from her parted lips and flows directly into the sharp facets of the red gem. The light fades, leaving the gemstone cool to the touch. The priests of the 8 divines wrap her body in layers of white linen cloth and carry her down the stone steps into the subterranean catacombs beneath the city. They place her inside a carved marble sarcophagus, grip their heavy iron chisels, and carve the word saint into the heavy stone lid. The years continue to turn, and a new generation of human priests begins to gather in the narrow alleyways and stone cloisters of Cyrodiil. They wear stiff, unadorned grey robes and carry walking sticks of dark wood. These priests look at the Aliad lords walking through the markets in their bright silks and grip their wooden staves tightly. They stand on empty wooden crates in the public squares, pointing their fingers at the elven merchants and shouting harsh words to the human crowds. They distribute rough paper pamphlets written in black ink, demanding strict adherence to human doctrines and the total removal of elven texts from the libraries. The crowds surrounding them grow larger, and the grey-robed priests organize their followers into tight marching columns, preparing to drive the remaining elves out of the city gates. The scribes sitting in the lower chambers of the white gold tower pull fresh sheets of parchment from their wooden cabinets and write the year 1E361 at the top of the ledgers. The wet ink dries on the page as human priests, wearing heavy grey robes, march through the central avenues of the capital city. They carry tall walking sticks carved from dense ash wood and tap the iron tips against the cobblestones in perfect unison. A thick-furred Imgur named Maruch walks at the front of this procession. Maruch stands upright on thick, muscular legs, covered entirely in coarse brown hair, and his lower jaw protrudes far past his upper lip. He holds a scroll of rough paper tightly in his right fist, raising it above his head and shouting harsh, guttural words to the gathered human crowds. Maruch steps onto a platform of stacked limestone blocks in the center of the market square. He points a thick, furred finger at the Aliad merchants standing near their wooden stalls. The Imgur prophet commands the human priests to seize the elves. The grey-robed men grab the Aliads by their silk tunics, pull them onto the dirt, and bind their wrists with heavy hemp ropes. They snatch the blue welkin stones from the market tables, raise iron hammers, and smash the glowing crystals into fine blue powder. The followers of Maruch refer to themselves as the Alessian Order. They enforce their strict doctrines through immediate physical action. The priests walk through the city streets, kicking down the wooden doors of Aeolid estates and dragging the elven families out by their hair. They pile the elven scrolls, embroidered tapestries, and glass statues into massive heaps in the center of the stone courtyards. The priests pour whale oil over the piles and strike flint and steel, setting the artifacts ablaze. Thick black smoke rises above the cyrodiilic jungle, carrying the smell of burning silk and melting glass through the humid air. The Order imposes strict physical regulations on the human citizens of the empire. Priests stand at the city gates, holding wooden measuring sticks to check the exact length of the linen cloaks worn by the merchants. They inspect the cargo in the market stalls, throwing clay jars of imported elven wine into the gutters and crushing the fired clay beneath their heavy boots. They carve the 77 inflexible doctrines of Maruk into thick iron plates and bolt these metal plates to the stone walls of the public squares. Citizens walk past the iron plates, keeping their heads bowed and their eyes fixed on the dirt to avoid drawing the attention of the roving grey-robed patrols. Inside the temples, the grey-robed priests extinguish the fires burning in the 8 bronze braziers. They carry heavy wooden mallets and strike the marble statues of the elven ancestor gods, fracturing the smooth stone faces and knocking the carved wings off the eagle totems. They replace the broken marble with rough-hewn blocks of grey granite, placing plain iron bowls on the stone surfaces. The priests chant their new prayers in loud, monotonous voices, striking their wooden staves against the granite to keep a steady, driving rhythm. The remaining Aeolid lords gather their few possessions under the watch of these chanting priests. They load small wooden chests filled with silver coins and folded wool blankets onto 2-wheeled wooden carts. The elves pull these carts themselves, straining their back muscles as they walk away from the white marble estates their ancestors built. The human priests line the dirt roads, holding their iron-tipped staves and watching the elven families march toward the western borders. The wooden wheels of the carts leave deep ruts in the mud as the Aelids cross the shallow rivers. The elves walk into the dense Valenwood forests to join the Bosmer, and others head north toward the rocky hills of High Rock, leaving their former homes entirely empty. Inside the capital, the grey-robed priests erase all physical traces of elven influence. Human masons climb wooden ladders and use heavy iron chisels to break the carved bird feathers off the Aeolid columns. They seal the subterranean bathhouses by pushing massive boulders in front of the archways. They replace the blue magical lights in the high corridors with standard torches of pine wood and animal fat. The imperial city takes on a uniform grey color, coated in the soot from the burning torches and filled with the smell of unwashed wool. The priests stand on the high balconies of the white gold tower, looking down at the bare stone streets and the orderly lines of citizens marching to the fields. The Alessian Order expands its physical reach outward from the central city. The priests form long columns, walking behind soldiers clad in interlocking iron plates and carrying heavy steel broadswords. They walk along the western dirt roads, crossing the wide Neben River and moving toward the rocky highlands of the Colovian estates. In these western mountains, human kings sit inside strong stone fortresses, wearing hammered iron helms and sharpening their heavy battle axes as they watch the grey robes approach their borders. King Rislav Larich sits on a wooden throne inside the stone keep of Skingrad. He wears a tunic of thick brown leather and holds a large Colovian falcon on his forearm. The bird grips his leather bracer with sharp black talons. Rislav looks out through the narrow vertical windows of his hall, watching the Colovian guards patrol the high stone walls. The guards wear helms of hardened leather and carry iron broadswords, their boots stepping heavily on the grey cobblestones. The western estates of Colovia operate independently, raising their own horses, hunting their own deer in the rocky highlands, and ignoring the strict religious decrees issued from the capital city in the east. Emperor Gorius sits on the ruby throne in the white gold tower, surrounded by the grey-robed priests of the Alessian order. He wears an iron breastplate over a grey tunic, fully adopting the austere style of the priesthood. Gorius unrolls a map of the Colovian estates onto a marble table and places a heavy iron marker directly over the city of Skingrad. He commands his generals to assemble the imperial army in the central courtyards. The soldiers sharpen their steel spears on grinding stones, pack wooden crates with dried meat and hardtack, and strap heavy iron saddles onto their war horses. Gorius orders the army to march westward, intending to force King Rislav to submit to the Alessian doctrines and pay tribute to the capital. The imperial army marches out of the city gates, their boots kicking up clouds of brown dust from the dirt roads. The column of soldiers stretches for miles across the Nibene Valley. They carry large banners of plain grey cloth on high wooden poles, and the priests walk alongside the soldiers, chanting the 77 doctrines of Maruk. The heavy wooden wheels of their supply carts sink into the muddy ruts of the road. King Rislav receives warning of the approaching army from scouts riding fast horses. He steps out of his keep, mounts a large black stallion, and commands his archers to gather on the high ridges overlooking the eastern road. The Colovian archers carry longbows carved from flexible yew wood and wear tunics dyed in earth tones to blend in with the rocky hillside. They carry leather quivers filled with arrows tipped in sharp, jagged flint. Rislav positions his heavy infantry at the base of the pass, their large wooden shields forming a solid wall across the road. The imperial army reaches the narrow pass leading toward Skingrad. Emperor Gorius rides at the front, his iron armor shining in the sunlight. He expects the Colovian king to open the city gates and surrender immediately upon seeing the massive numbers of the imperial force. Instead, Rislav rides his black stallion directly toward the emperor, closing the distance between them until their horses stand chest to chest. Rislav points a bare finger at Gorius, speaks a few sharp words, and turns his horse around, riding back toward his own lines. As soon as Rislav reaches the Colovian shield wall, he raises his right hand. The archers on the ridges draw back their bowstrings, the wood creaking under the tension. They release the strings, sending a thick volley of flint-tipped arrows down into the imperial column. The arrows pierce the iron armor of the eastern soldiers, striking their shoulders and necks. The imperial horses rear up on their hind legs, throwing their riders onto the hard dirt road. The grey-robed priests fall to the ground, dropping their wooden walking sticks. Emperor Gorius orders his infantry to charge forward, but the Colovian shield wall holds firm. The heavy iron battle-axes of the Skingrad soldiers chop into the wooden shields of the imperial vanguard, splintering the boards and breaking the iron rims. Rislav leads a contingent of cavalry around the flanks, striking the imperial supply carts and setting the canvas covers on fire with burning pitch. The smoke from the burning carts fills the narrow pass, blinding the eastern soldiers and causing the column to break formation. Gorius realizes his army cannot advance through the pass. He shouts orders to his generals, pulling his horse around and directing the remaining troops to retreat northward into the highlands. The imperial soldiers leave their broken carts and wounded men in the mud, marching up into the steep, rocky terrain to avoid the Colovian archers. The retreat proves disastrous for the imperial army. The Colovian highlands consist of jagged ravines and dense pine forests. The heavy iron armor of the eastern soldiers slows their movements, and their boots slip on the loose shale. As they navigate through a deep valley, loud horns sound from the ridges above them. The armies of Kavach, another independent Colovian city, stand on the high rocks. The Kavach soldiers push massive boulders down the steep slopes, crushing the imperial troops and blocking the narrow exits of the valley. Emperor Gorius escapes the ambush with only a fraction of his original force, leaving the bulk of his army dead in the Colovian mountains. He rides back toward the white gold tower, his iron armor dented and coated in brown mud. King Rislav returns to Skingrad, feeding fresh meat to his falcon and drinking mead from a wooden tankard in his stone hall. The Colovian kings look at the broken imperial spears lying in the mountain passes and recognize that the power of the Alessian order can be broken by steel and high ground. They fortify their walls, sharpen their battle axes, and establish the Colovian estates as a permanent physical barrier against the Eastern priesthood. The failure of the imperial army reaches the ears of rulers far beyond the Cyrodiilic borders. In the northwestern province of High Rock, a different group of elves sit inside tall towers of smooth stone, listening to the reports of the Colovian victory. They wear elegant robes and wield staves of carved ivory, observing the weakness of the human empire and preparing to expand their own territory across the northern coastline. On the northwestern coast of Tamriel, ocean waves strike the steep limestone cliffs of High Rock. The elves of the Direni clan inhabit this region, ruling from the Adamantine Tower on the Isle of Balfiera. The Adamantine Tower consists of a single massive cylinder of dark grey metal driven deep into the bedrock of the island. The Direni elves wear polished silver armor and carry longswords forged from refined steel and glass. They walk through the stone courtyards of their keeps alongside their human subjects. These humans possess a mixture of elven and Nedic physical features, displaying slightly pointed ears and angular jawlines. They wear chainmail shirts and hold iron halberds, standing shoulder to shoulder with their elven lords. The Direni supply these human soldiers with enchanted rings and potions of healing, integrating them directly into the military ranks of their growing hegemony. The grey-robed priests of the Alessian order march out of the Colovian mountains and cross the border into the green valleys of High Rock. They carry their iron walking sticks and hoist grey cloth banners on tall pine poles. Thousands of imperial soldiers follow the priests, wearing heavy iron breastplates and gripping broad steel battle axes. The priests chant the doctrines of Maruch, their voices echoing off the granite ridges. They pull wooden wagons loaded with iron cages, bringing their strict religious laws into the elven territories. They stop at the edges of the Direni estates and plant their grey banners in the soil, raising their pitch-soaked torches to burn the elven towers. The Direni lords step out of their fortresses to meet the imperial army on the flat, grassy expanse of the Glenumbra moors. The elven sorcerers raise their wooden staves and cast spheres of crackling blue lightning into the advancing Alessian lines. The lightning strikes the iron armor of the imperial soldiers, melting the breastplates and sending the men falling into the damp grass. The Breton infantry charge forward with their halberds, driving the iron hooks into the wooden shields of the imperial vanguard. The Alessian soldiers swing their heavy battle axes, chopping through the silver armor of the elven knights and leaving deep trenches of churned mud across the battlefield. The clash of steel and iron fills the air, and the smell of charred flesh mixes with the scent of trampled clover. The two armies push against each other for hours, turning the green moors into a wide field of broken spears, shattered glass swords, and severed limbs. The physical conflict between the Alessian Empire and the Durrani hegemony stretches across the entire province, draining the supplies of both armies. The imperial supply lines collapse as Colovian kings block the mountain passes with boulders, keeping their grain carts and fresh horses inside their own walls. Alessian soldiers drop their heavy battle axes in the mud and walk back toward Cyrodiil in torn, blood-stained tunics. On the opposing side, the Durrani lords empty their vaults of silver coins and exhaust their limited stores of magical crystals. The elves pull their surviving knights back to the Isle of Balfiera, abandoning their mainland stone fortresses. Thick green vines grow over the empty Durrani keeps, and the heavy wooden doors rot on their iron hinges. Across the continent of Tamriel, armies retreat behind tall walls and secure their heavy iron gates. Smoke rises from the burning wooden wagons in High Rock, and thick brown dust settles over the barren streets of the Cyrodiilic capital. The Colovian kings sit on their wooden thrones, watching the western borders and keeping their archers stationed on the high ridges. While the western provinces grind their iron weapons to blunt edges against each other, a separate conflict escalates in the eastern ash plains. The Nords of Skyrim stand on the parapets of their basalt keeps in Resdayn, looking down at the grey valleys. Below them, the Chimera and the Dwemer gather their own forces, sharpening their chitin swords and polishing their brass machines to push the northern invaders back into the snow. The Nordic columns march through the grey valleys of Resdayn, holding their iron battle axes and wooden shields. They encounter a united front of elves standing before the basalt mountains. The Chimera warriors wear armor constructed from layered insect shells, holding long, curved swords of hardened resin and bone. Next to them stand the Dwemer infantry, encased entirely in heavy plates of polished bronze and brass. The Dwemer hold mechanical crossbows that fire steel bolts through thick iron gears. The two elven races, separated for centuries by their religious and cultural differences, now stand shoulder to shoulder against the northern human invaders. Indoril Nerevar rides a massive insectoid gar at the front of the Chimera lines. He wears a helm of molded bone and carries a long, curved glass blade. Dumak Dwarfking stands beside him, gripping a massive steel warhammer and wearing a thick bronze crown over his braided beard. The two elven leaders lock their arms together in the center of the battlefield, solidifying the military alliance between their peoples. Nerevar raises his glass sword and points the tip toward the Nordic columns. The Chimera archers draw back their bowstrings and fire volleys of bone-tipped arrows into the human ranks. The arrows strike the iron breastplates of the Nords, lodging in the heavy bear pelts and finding the gaps at the neck and shoulders. The Dwemer centurions roll forward on brass wheels, extending long metal blades from their spherical bodies to cut down the human soldiers. Pressurized steam vents from the exhaust pipes on the automaton chassis, filling the ash fields with thick white clouds and scalding the bare skin of the Nordic infantry. The Nords push their heavy oak shields forward, swinging their iron axes at the rolling Dwemer machines. The iron blades dent the brass plating, but the automatons continue to advance, their internal gears grinding over the rocks. The Chimera infantry charge into the chaotic melee, their bone swords slicing through the thick fur cloaks of the human warriors. Nerevar swings his glass blade, cutting down the Nordic jarls and breaking their wooden shields into splinters. Dumak swings his heavy warhammer, crushing the iron helmets of the human soldiers and driving them back toward the steep mountain passes. The combined elven forces push the Nords out of the river valleys and away from the basalt quarries. The human warriors retreat through the narrow ravines of the Velothi Mountains, leaving their broken axes and torn bear pelts in the grey ash. They climb back up the snow-covered slopes, retreating behind their wooden palisades in Skyrim and abandoning their eastern fortresses. With the human army driven from the borders, Nerevar and Dumak return to the center of Resdayn. The two leaders stand in a large stone courtyard, surrounded by the generals of the Kimmer clans and the chief tonal architects of the Dwemer cities. Nerevar takes off his bone helm, and Dumak lowers his steel warhammer. The Kimmer leader speaks to the gathered crowds, proposing a permanent political union between the two races. He names this new government the First Council. Dumak agrees, striking the butt of his warhammer against the stone tiles to seal the pact. The Kimmer clans restructure themselves into the great houses of Morrowind. House Redoran builds high stone walls and trains new companies of spearmen. House Telvanni cultivates massive fungal towers, growing the organic structures out of the volcanic soil to house their mages. House Halalu secures the trade routes, moving caravans of wooden carts across the ash roads to exchange goods with the Dwemer cities. The Dwemer open the heavy brass doors of their subterranean fortresses. They allow the Kimmer merchants to enter the glowing tunnels and trade sacks of saltris and bundles of woven cloth for bronze tools and steel blades. Kimmer children run through the underground halls, watching the mechanical spiders scurry across the polished stone floors. The Dwemer tonal architects visit the Dwemer settlements, installing steam-powered heating grates inside the bone-framed tents to ward off the cold night air. Nerevar and Dumak sit together at a long wooden table in the central council hall, drafting new laws and establishing trade regulations. They drink sweet wine from clay cups and discuss the exact borders separating the fungal forests from the mining quarries. The Kimmer and Dwemer populations mingle in the markets, their voices mixing over the sound of the grinding brass gears and the low grunts of the Gwar herds. In the year 1E416, the scribes write the details of this new alliance onto fresh parchment scrolls. They record the creation of the First Council and document the unprecedented peace between the ash-covered Kimmer and the subterranean Dwemer. The eastern province of Resdayn thrives under this joint leadership, building new cities and expanding its agricultural reach across the volcanic plains. The elven leaders look at the quiet mountain passes in the west, confident that their combined military strength will prevent any further human incursions from the snowy peaks of Skyrim. Indoril Nerevar and Dumak Dwarfking sit across from each other at a wide table of polished obsidian in the central council hall of Resdayn. Tall pillars of dark basalt support the high ceiling, and braziers of burning pitch illuminate the corners of the room. Nerevar wears a tunic of woven golden silk, and Dumak wears a heavy breastplate of overlapping bronze scales. They slide thick parchment scrolls across the smooth stone surface, tracing the paths of trade routes and marking the boundaries of new farm settlements with pieces of black charcoal. The Kimmer leader pours sweet blackberry wine from a clay jug into 2 silver goblets, handing one to the Dwemer king. They raise the goblets, tap the silver rims together, and drink the dark red liquid. Their constant physical proximity and shared meals dictate the daily functions of their combined government. Outside the council hall, the Kimmer and the Dwemer exchange goods in crowded marketplaces. Khmer farmers guide large, grey-skinned pack cars through the wide avenues, carrying heavy woven sacks of harvested saltris, pale ash yams, and bundles of marshmallow reeds. Dwemer engineers meet them at the wooden stalls, exchanging interlocking brass gears, sharp steel farming tools, and copper pipes for the raw agricultural yields. Dwemer tonal architects install pressurized steam vents inside the Khmer settlements, directing warm air from the underground boilers through brass tubing to heat the bone-framed tents during the cold ash storms. The two races walk shoulder to shoulder along the paved roads, their leather boots and heavy metal treads pressing into the volcanic soil together. To secure these daily exchanges, Dumak commissions the Dwemer smiths to forge a specific token of authority. The metal workers melt down raw silver inside stone crucibles and pour the molten liquid into a circular clay mold. They strike the cooled ring with small steel hammers and carve the crest of a crescent moon overlapping a multi-pointed star directly into the metal. The Dwemer enchanters submerge the ring in glowing blue liquids and expose it to the intense heat of their subterranean furnaces, binding deadly protective spells into the silver. Dumak carries the finished ring, known as Moon and Star, into the council hall and places it in Nerevar's open palm. Nerevar slides the heavy silver band onto his finger. The magic within the metal kills anyone else who attempts to wear it, ensuring only Nerevar bears the physical authority to speak for the combined tribes and cities. The leaders of the Khmer clans and the Dwemer strongholds look at the silver ring shining on Nerevar's hand and bow their heads in submission to his rulings. Nerevar surrounds himself with a retinue of trusted advisors. His queen, Almalexia, walks beside him in the public squares. She wears flowing dresses of spun spider silk and thin gold chains woven through her long black hair. Her skin features the bright gold color of the Khmer race, and she holds the hands of the settlement leaders, offering them grain from her personal stores. Heavy gold bracelets clink around her wrists as she moves through the crowds. Two male counselors flank Nerevar during his meetings. Sotha Sil wears plain cloth robes and carries leather satchels filled with dried plant roots, empty glass vials, and small brass calipers. He sits in quiet corners of the council hall, studying the mechanical schematics of the Dwemer and grinding pungent ingredients in a stone mortar. Vivek stands on Nerevar's other side, gripping a steel-tipped spear and holding rolls of parchment covered in his own handwritten poetry. Dark black ink stains his fingertips. Vivek trains the Khmer spearmen in the courtyards, stepping over the practice mats and demonstrating sweeping strikes with the wooden shafts of his weapons. Behind Nerevar stands his dedicated shield-bearer, Alandro Sul. This warrior wears a heavy chainmail shirt known as the Wraithmail. The iron links of the shirt clink together with every step he takes, producing a constant metallic rattle. Alandro Sul carries a massive shield of layered insect chitin and hardwood, positioning himself directly between Nerevar and the open doorways of the council halls. The closest of Nerevar's servants is Vorin Dagoth, the Lord High Counselor of House Dagoth. Vorin wears robes of dark red wool and a heavy gold collar around his neck. He stands inches from Nerevar's ear, whispering the reports of the Ashland Scouts and the tallies of the Eastern treasuries. Vorin Dagoth carries the sigil of a scarab beetle on his iron belt buckle. He rides a swift gar across the volcanic plains, inspecting the border outposts and delivering Nerevar's sealed edicts directly to the Khmer warlords and the Dwemer craft lords. Nerevar hands Vorin Dagoth his most sensitive military maps and his heavy rings of iron stronghold keys. Hundreds of years pass with Nerevar and Dumak managing the province through these physical exchanges of parchment, silver coins, and spoken orders. The Khmer construct taller buildings of hardened mud and stone, and the Dwemer expand their subterranean cities deeper into the earth. The population of Resdayn swells, filling the river valleys with rows of cultivated crops, and the underground caverns with spinning brass machinery. The Dwemer mining crews drive their iron pickaxes into the walls of the deepest tunnels beneath the central volcano, known as Red Mountain. They swing heavy steel hammers against iron wedges, splitting the solid basalt and hauling the broken rocks away in brass carts. The tunnels grow darker and hotter as the miners descend closer to the molten core of the volcano. Sweat pours down their faces, and the leather grips of their tools grow slick with moisture. A miner swings his heavy pickaxe against the dark stone wall, breaking away a thick layer of rock to expose a massive, pulsing red cavity hidden in the center of the earth. The Dwemer miner swings his heavy iron pickaxe, striking the wall of volcanic basalt. The rock splinters and falls away, revealing a large cavity in the stone. A massive, pulsing organ rests in the center of the hollow chamber. It beats with a slow, heavy rhythm, sending deep vibrations through the floorboards of the Dwemer scaffolding and rattling the miner's iron tools. The organ shares the shape of a human heart, but measures several feet across. A thick crust of cooled magma covers its surface, glowing a dull red in the dim light. High Craft Lord Kagranak walks into the chamber, pushing past the miners. He wears a heavy apron of cured netch leather and carries a brass clipboard. Kagranak looks at the pulsing object, recognizing it as the heart of Lorkhan, the physical remnant of the ancient creator deity. He commands the miners to expand the cavern around the heart, taking careful measurements of its dimensions with his copper calipers. Kagranak retreats to his private forge, locking the heavy bronze doors behind him. He stands over an anvil of solid steel and pumps a leather bellows to increase the heat of his furnace. He uses thick iron tongs to pull glowing metals from the coals, hammering them into specific shapes designed to interact with the heart. Kagranak forges 3 distinct tools. First, he creates Sunder, a heavy hammer with a head of dense, dark metal, built to strike the heart and produce a precise tone. Next, he shapes Keening, a short blade with a jagged, crystalline edge, designed to flay and focus the energy released by Sunder's strike. Finally, he constructs Wraithguard, a heavy gauntlet crafted from interlocking brass plates and embedded with glowing soul gems, built to protect the wearer's hand from the intense heat and magical feedback of the other 2 tools. Kagranak lays the 3 finished tools on a stone table. He unrolls large sheets of thick parchment and uses a piece of black charcoal to draw the schematics for a new creation. He sketches the limbs and torso of a massive mechanical golem, taller than the highest towers of Resdayn. He labels this construct Numidium. Kagranak plans to build this brass god and use Sunder and Keening to channel the raw energy of the heart into its metallic frame, giving the Dwemer their own physical deity to command. He distributes the blueprints to his most trusted tonal architects, instructing them to begin casting the massive brass plates required for the golem's construction. Vorin Dagoth, the Lord High Counselor of House Dagoth, patrols the deep tunnels beneath Red Mountain. He wears his dark red wool robes and carries an iron lantern, checking the borders of the Khmer and Dwemer mining claims. As he walks past Kagranak's forge, he notices a discarded sheet of parchment lying in the ash. Vorin Dagoth picks up the paper, holds his lantern close, and traces the lines of the brass golem. He walks further down the tunnel and looks into the central chamber, watching the heart of Lorkhan pulse against the basalt walls. He sees the Dwemer engineers taking measurements and assembling wooden scaffolds around the ancient organ. Vorin Dagoth rolls up the parchment and hurries out of the tunnels. He rides his Gar across the ash plains, driving the beast toward the Khmer capital. He runs into the central council hall, his boots tracking grey ash onto the polished obsidian floor. Induril Nerevar sits at the long wooden table, discussing agricultural yields with his councillors Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil. Vorin Dagoth throws the parchment schematic onto the table and tells Nerevar what he saw beneath Red Mountain. He describes the pulsing heart, the 3 specialized tools, and Kagranak's plan to build a mechanical god. Nerevar looks at the charcoal drawings, his brow furrowing. He passes the parchment to Sotha Sil. The councillor traces the brass joints of the golem with his brass calipers and confirms the mathematical feasibility of the Dwemer design. Almalexia stands up, her silk dresses rustling against the wooden chairs. She strikes her fist against the table, declaring the Dwemer actions a severe violation of the religious pacts holding the First Council together. The Khmer worship the ancestors and the ancient spirits. They view the physical manipulation of divine remains as an unforgivable offense. Vivek grips his steel-tipped spear and urges Nerevar to call the Khmer generals to arms. He argues that the Dwemer will use this new mechanical god to conquer the surface of Resdain and enslave the Khmer houses. Nerevar raises his hand, asking for silence in the hall. He looks at the schematic of the Numidium and then at Vorin Dagoth. The Khmer leader decides he must speak with Dumak directly, hoping his long-standing alliance with the Dwemer king can prevent a full-scale war. He leaves his councillors in the hall, straps his glass sword to his hip, and prepares to walk back toward the steep slopes of Red Mountain to confront the king of the Deep Elves. Induril Nerevar rides his Gar up the steep, ash-covered slopes of Red Mountain, pulling the leather reins to guide the beast through the jagged basalt outcroppings. He leaves the Gar tied to a dead, blackened pine tree near the summit and walks the rest of the way on foot. Nerevar enters the main brass doors of the central Dwemer stronghold, passing groups of bronze automatons rolling down the wide stone corridors. He finds Dumak Dwarfking in a large, open courtyard near the upper foundries. Dumak strikes a heavy iron hammer against a hot bronze plate, sparks flying from the anvil to land on his heavy leather apron. Nerevar pulls the rolled parchment schematic from his belt and throws it onto a flat stone workbench, demanding an explanation from the Dwemer king. Dumak wipes the soot from his forehead with a thick forearm and looks at the drawing of the brass golem. The Dwemer king grips his hammer tightly and tells Nerevar that the affairs of the Dwemer engineers are no concern of the Khmer houses. High Craft Lord Kagranak steps out from a side doorway, wearing his netch leather apron and carrying a set of copper calipers. Kagranak glares at the Khmer leader, insulted that a tribal warlord would question the physical sciences and architectural designs of the Deep Elves. Nerevar presses his hand against the hilt of his glass sword, reminding Dumak of their mutual pacts and the strict religious boundaries established by the First Council. Dumak refuses to halt the construction of the Numidium or surrender the heart of Lorcan, crossing his heavy, muscular arms over his chest. Nerevar turns around, his golden silk tunic swishing against the stone doorframe, and walks out of the stronghold. He travels directly to the shrine of Azura on the northern coast of Resdain. He enters the small stone temple and kneels before the marble statue of the Daedric prince. He places offerings of dried ash yams and silver coins in a bronze bowl at the base of the statue. Azura's voice echoes through the cold stone room, confirming the truth of the Dwemer's mechanical god and validating the threat to the Chimera ancestors. Nerevar returns to the Central Council Hall and gathers his advisors. He relays his conversation with Dumak and the confirmation from the Daedric Shrine. Almalexia, Sotha Sil, and Vivek stand around the obsidian table, uniform in their council. They press their hands against the smooth stone and demand that Nerevar declare war immediately. Vivek picks up his steel-tipped spear and points it at the map of Red Mountain, insisting that the Dwemer must be stopped before the brass golem takes its first step. Nerevar looks at the silver moon and star ring on his finger, still hoping to preserve the physical peace he built with his old friend. He decides to ride back to Red Mountain for one final attempt at diplomacy. When Nerevar returns to the Dwemer courtyard, the atmosphere has completely changed. Dumak stands with a contingent of heavily armed Dwemer guards, wearing full plates of polished brass and holding mechanical crossbows. Kagrenax stands behind the king, gripping the hilt of the crystalline dagger, keening. Nerevar asks Dumak to dismantle the golem and hand over the heart. Dumak shouts back, his voice echoing off the stone walls, refusing to let the Chimera dictate the actions of the Dwemer people. The argument turns bitter, with both leaders hurling harsh words across the open space. The guards raise their crossbows, the heavy steel gears clicking into place. Nerevar draws his glass sword, the sharp edge catching the light from the burning foundries. He backs away slowly, keeping his eyes on the Dwemer king, and retreats through the brass doors. The fragile peace of the First Council shatters on the stone floor. Nerevar mounts his Gar and rides back down the ash slopes, pulling the reins hard to speed his descent. He returns to his generals and issues the command to assemble the armies. The Chimera warlords blow into their carved bone war horns, sending the signal across the fungal valleys and ashen plains. House Redoran spearmen form tight marching columns, carrying heavy shields of layered insect shell. House Telvanni mages gather their wooden staves and pouches of spell reagents. Chimera scouts pack their quivers with bone-tipped arrows and secure their leather boots for the long march. Across the province, the Chimera prepare to march on the central volcano. The War of the First Council begins, drawing every elven warrior in Resdain toward the slopes of Red Mountain. The scribes disagree on the exact year, placing the battle somewhere around 1E 700. They also disagree on the specific armies present on the volcanic slopes. Some ledgers record that the Nords returned from Skyrim, bringing heavy iron battle axes and war dogs to fight alongside the Dwemer. Other scrolls claim that columns of orcs marched down from the Dragontail Mountains, wearing thick steel plate and swinging heavy maces to aid the Deep Elves. Despite these conflicting accounts, the physical actions of the central leaders remain consistent across the records. Indoril Nerevar rides his Gar at the head of the Chimera army, holding his glass sword. The air fills with thick grey ash from the erupting volcano, coating his golden silk tunic. He leads his infantry down the northern slopes, presenting a wide, exposed flank to the Dwemer fortresses. Dumak Dwarfking observes this movement from the brass parapets and commands his bronze automatons to roll out of the heavy gates. He directs his entire army into the open ash fields, intending to crush the Chimera lines with a massive frontal assault. Nerevar does not stay to fight the brass machines. As soon as the Dwemer forces commit to the field, Nerevar pulls his Gar around and leads a small, elite contingent of warriors directly up the steep, unguarded paths toward the central crater. Vorin Dagoth runs beside him, holding a curved bone sword. Alandro Sul follows close behind, the iron rings of his wraithmail rattling against his layered insect shell shield. They push through the wooden doors of the main Dwemer citadel, cutting down the few remaining guards with sharp strikes from their blades. The Chimera leaders descend the stone stairs into the deep caverns. They enter the central chamber, where the heart of Lorkhan pulses steadily against the basalt walls. High Craft Lord Kagrenac stands before the heart, wearing his netch leather apron. He holds the jagged crystalline dagger, Keening, in his right hand, and the heavy hammer, Sunder, in his left. He wears the brass gauntlet, Wraithguard, to protect his skin from the intense heat radiating from the ancient organ. Dumak Dwarf King bursts into the chamber through a side tunnel, his bronze armor dented and coated in grey ash. He sees Nerevar approaching the heart and raises his massive steel warhammer. The two kings clash in the center of the subterranean room. Dumak swings his hammer in wide arcs, striking Nerevar's bone helm and cracking the protective shell. Nerevar thrusts his glass sword, finding the gaps in Dumak's bronze plates and driving the sharp edge deep into the Dwemer's side. Both leaders fall to the stone floor, their armor leaking thick pools of blood onto the basalt tiles. Vorin Dagoth and Alandro Sul rush forward to protect Nerevar, raising their shields against Kagrenac. The High Craft Lord steps backward, moving closer to the pulsing red heart. He looks at the bleeding body of his king and hears the distant sounds of the battle raging outside the mountain. The Chimera warriors step toward him, their bone swords drawn. Kagrenac does not strike at the approaching elves. He turns entirely away from them and faces the massive glowing organ. He raises Sunder high above his head, the heavy metal hammer casting long shadows across the cavern walls. He brings the hammer down, striking the crust of the heart with a deafening metallic ring that shakes the stone floor and vibrates through the iron pickaxes left by the miners. Instantly, he steps forward and drives the sharp edge of Keening directly into the point of impact, twisting the crystalline blade to channel the raw energy flowing from the wound. The air pressure inside the chamber drops drastically. The blue light from the soul gems embedded in Wraithguard flares into a blinding white flash. A high-pitched, screeching tone fills the cavern, piercing the eardrums of the Chimera warriors and shattering the glass lenses of the Dwemer measuring instruments scattered across the wooden tables. Above ground, the Dwemer army pushes the Chimera forces back across the ash plains. A Dwemer centurion raises its brass blade to strike a fallen Chimera spearman. The high-pitched tone from the subterranean chamber echoes out of the steam vents and across the battlefield. The centurion freezes in place. The brass gears stop turning, and the pressurized steam hisses out of the exhaust pipes, dissipating into the grey air. Inside the chamber, the white light fades. Nerevar pulls himself up from the stone floor, gripping his side. He looks toward the center of the room. The heart of Lorkhan continues to pulse steadily against the basalt. Sunder, Keening, and Wraithguard lie abandoned on the dirt. High Craft Lord Kagrenac is gone. Dumak Dwarf King is gone. Nerevar turns and walks back up the stone stairs, pushing open the heavy doors of the citadel. He looks out over the battlefield. The brass automatons stand motionless in the ash. The iron crossbows lie in the dirt. Every single Dwemer on the slopes of Red Mountain has completely vanished. Nerevar steps out of the heavy brass doors of the citadel, leaving the quiet subterranean tunnels behind him. The air outside is thick with falling ash and smells of sulfur. The Chimera warriors slowly walk out from behind the jagged basalt ridges, lowering their bone shields. They approach the Dwemer fortresses and look at the motionless brass automatons standing in the dirt. Vorin Dagoth walks up a steep incline and pushes open the door to a small Dwemer lookout post. Inside, a copper kettle boils on a small coal stove. 2 bronze plates sit on a wooden table, holding portions of roasted meat and sliced fungus. The heavy iron chairs are pushed back from the table, but the room is completely empty. Vorin Dagoth walks back outside and reports to Nerevar that the entire Dwemer race has vanished, leaving their armor, their weapons, and their half-eaten meals behind them. Nerevar turns around and walks back into the central citadel. Vorin Dagoth follows him down the stone steps into the deep chamber containing the heart of Lorkhan. The pulsing red organ continues to beat against the basalt wall. The 3 tools, Sunder, Keening, and Wraithguard, lie in the dirt where Kagrenac dropped them. Vorin Dagoth picks up the heavy hammer, Sunder, and grips the handle of the crystalline blade, Keening. He looks at Nerevar and tells his leader that these tools are extremely dangerous. He urges Nerevar to smash the tools against the stone floor and destroy them immediately, pointing out that Kagrenac used these very objects to erase his entire race from the physical world. Nerevar looks at the pulsing heart and the glowing tools in Vorin Dagoth's hands. He shakes his head and tells Vorin that he cannot make such a monumental decision alone. Nerevar instructs Vorin Dagoth to stay in the chamber and guard the tools and the heart. He orders his High Counselor to prevent anyone else from touching the objects, while he returns to the surface to consult with his queen, Almalexia, and his advisors, Sotha Sil and Vivec. Vorin Dagoth nods, gripping the tools tightly and taking a position directly in front of the heart. Nerevar climbs the stone stairs and exits the citadel. He finds Almalexia, Sotha Sil, and Vivec standing in a Chimera command tent on the lower slopes of the mountain. He tells them everything he saw in the chamber: the death of Dumak, the strike of Kagrenac's hammer, the disappearance of the Dwemer, and the 3 magical tools now guarded by Vorin Dagoth. Sotha Sil listens closely to the description of the tools. He pulls his brass calipers from his leather satchel and argues that the tools should be preserved and studied, not destroyed. He claims that the Chimera could use the power of the heart to protect Resdayn from future invasions. Almalexia and Vivec agree with Sotha Sil, nodding their heads and pressing their hands against the wooden table in the center of the tent. Nerevar listens to his advisors, but he feels uneasy about harnessing the power that destroyed the Dwemer. He draws his glass sword and holds it out over the table. He demands that Almalexia, Sotha Sil, and Vivec swear a binding oath to never use the tools to siphon power from the heart. The 3 advisors look at the sharp edge of the glass blade, place their hands over the weapon, and speak the words of the oath aloud, promising to leave the heart untouched. With the oath sworn, Nerevar leads his 3 advisors back up the ash-covered slopes of Red Mountain. They enter the brass doors of the citadel and descend the stone steps into the deep chamber. Vorin Dagoth stands in front of the heart, holding Sunder and Keening. His eyes are wide, and his breathing is shallow and rapid. He looks at the approaching Chimera leaders and tightens his grip on the heavy hammer. Vorin Dagoth refuses to hand the tools over to Nerevar. He claims that the tools are corrupting, that they whisper directly into his mind, and that the other counselors intend to steal the power of the heart for themselves. Nerevar stops walking and holds out his open hand, demanding the tools. Vorin Dagoth shakes his head, raises the hammer Sunder, and steps forward. Nerevar draws his glass sword, his golden silk tunic brushing against the stone wall. The 2 former friends face each other in the dim red light of the chamber, gripping their weapons tightly as the heart of Lorkhan pulses steadily behind them. Scribes in the mainland libraries dip their quills into black ink and write two specific sequences of physical events regarding the final moments of Indaril Nerevar. The tribunal temple scribes record a brutal clash inside the deep subterranean chamber. Vorin Dagoth grips the heavy brass handle of Sunder and swings the dark metal hammer toward Nerevar's head. Nerevar ducks below the heavy iron head and steps forward, driving his glass sword toward Vorin's ribs. Vorin parries the glass blade with the crystalline edge of keening and drags the sharp tool across Nerevar's chest. The cut severs the golden silk tunic and slices deep into the Khyma leader's flesh. Red blood pours from the wound, spilling onto the dark basalt floor. Nerevar shifts his weight, brings his glass sword down in a heavy arc, and strikes Vorin Dagoth in the shoulder. The impact forces Vorin to open his hand and drop Sunder onto the stone tiles. Vorin clutches his bleeding shoulder, turns his back to Nerevar, and runs into the pitch-black tunnels branching off from the main chamber. Nerevar drops to his knees, pressing his bare hands against his bleeding chest. Almalexia, Sotha Sil, and Vivek run down the stone steps and find their leader collapsing on the floor. Nerevar commands his three advisors to kneel beside him on the bloody tiles. He points a trembling finger at Sunder and Keening lying in the dirt. He forces the tribunal to place their palms flat against the cold metal of the tools. Nerevar extracts a strict vocal promise from them, demanding they speak the exact words binding them to leave the objects alone in the dark cavern. The three advisors speak the required words into the quiet space. Nerevar exhales his final breath. His eyes glaze over with a milky film, and his body goes entirely limp on the stone floor. The Ashlander tribes of Resdain record a completely separate physical sequence of events on their stretched gar-skin scrolls. In this version, Nerevar walks out of the Dwemer citadel, whole and healthy, carrying Sunder, Keening, and Wraithguard in a heavy burlap sack. He meets Almalexia, Vivek, and Sotha Sil at the Khyma command tent on the lower slopes of the mountain. He drops the heavy sack onto the wooden table, causing the metal tools to clank against the boards. The three advisors look at the tools, draw their own weapons, and step toward Nerevar. Almalexia drives a dagger, coated in green netch venom, directly into Nerevar's abdomen. Vivek raises his steel-tipped spear and thrusts the point through Nerevar's thighs, forcing the Khyma leader to fall onto his back. Sotha Sil raises a heavy bronze hammer and strikes Nerevar across the face, shattering his bone helm into white fragments. Nerevar bleeds out onto the ash-covered dirt outside the tent. The three advisors stand over his body, reach their hands into the burlap sack, and wrap their fingers around the handles of the Dwemer tools. The differing parchment scrolls align to describe a single physical eruption from the mountain itself. Deep beneath the crust of Red Mountain, the magma boils and expands outward. The intense pressure shatters the basalt walls of the central crater. A massive column of liquid rock and burning ash erupts from the peak of the mountain, shooting thousands of feet into the sky. Rivers of bright orange lava flow down the slopes, swallowing the brass gates of the Dwemer strongholds and melting the mechanical spiders left outside the walls. Large boulders of flaming pumice rain down upon the surrounding valleys, crushing the bone-framed tents of the Khmer and igniting the giant mushroom stalks. Thick clouds of grey and black ash spread outward from the volcano, carried by the high atmospheric winds across the entire continent of Tamriel. The thick ash clouds form a solid grey blanket in the sky, obscuring the sun and casting permanent shadows over the land. The temperature across the continent plummets, bringing winter frost directly into the summer months. Thick layers of white ice form on the broad leaves of the cyrodiilic jungle trees. The rivers in High Rock freeze solid, trapping the wooden fishing boats in thick sheets of ice. The scribes sitting in their dark towers light wax candles to see their parchment and write the title, "The Year of Sun's Death," at the top of their ledgers. The crops in the fields wither and turn brown from the biting cold. The human and elven populations retreat into their stone keeps and light massive fires in their hearths, burning their wooden furniture to maintain warmth under the darkened sky. Amid the falling ash and freezing temperatures on the slopes of Red Mountain, Almalexia, Sotha Sil, and Vivek carry the three Dwemer tools back to the Kaima capital. They place the dark metal hammer, the crystalline blade, and the brass gauntlet on an obsidian table. They prepare to break the words of their sworn pact, trace the exact steps of High Craft Lord Kagranak, and press the tools directly against the heart of Lorcan to trigger a physical metamorphosis upon themselves. Almalexia, Sotha Sil, and Vivek stand in the deep basalt chamber beneath Red Mountain. The heart of Lorcan pulses against the rock wall, casting a steady red light over their faces. Sotha Sil steps forward and slides his hand into the brass gauntlet known as Wraithguard. He tightens the leather straps around his forearm and grips the heavy dark metal handle of Sunder. He raises the hammer and brings it down against the crust of the heart. The impact produces a low, resonant hum that shakes the iron pickaxes left on the cavern floor. Sotha Sil immediately takes the crystalline dagger, keening, and presses the sharp edge against the center of the impact site. He twists the blade, and a beam of concentrated white light shoots out of the heart, striking Sotha Sil directly in the chest. Sotha Sil holds his position and directs the flow of energy toward Almalexia and Vivek. The physical bodies of the three elves change rapidly. Their spines elongate, adding several inches to their height. A bright, continuous aura of white light surrounds their skin, illuminating the dark corners of the subterranean room. Their feet lift off the basalt floor, and they hover in the air. The heavy metal armor and silk robes they wear remain perfectly still as they float above the dirt. They open their eyes, and bright beams of magical energy project from their pupils. As the three advisors absorb the raw power of the heart, the temperature inside the deep cavern drops to freezing. A thick layer of white frost creeps across the basalt walls and coats the brass tools lying on the wooden tables. A cloud of sparkling silver dust gathers in the center of the room, coalescing into the physical form of the Daedric Prince Azura. She manifests as a towering elven woman wearing a long dress of woven starlight. She holds a silver crescent moon in one hand and a multifaceted star in the other. Azura points her silver moon at the three floating elves and speaks. She details the specific words of the oath they swore over Nerevar's glass sword just hours earlier. She states their actions directly violate that promise. The three floating elves keep their heads raised. Almalexia crosses her arms over her silk dress and speaks directly to the Daedric Prince. She declares that the Kaima possess their own living gods now and follow a new path of self-rule. She commands the Daedric Prince to leave the chamber and return to the realms of oblivion. Azura responds by raising both of her hands toward the ceiling of the cavern. She casts a massive wave of magical energy that travels up the shaft of the volcano and spreads outward across the entire province of Resdain. This wave rolls over the Kaima warriors standing on the ash slopes, the merchants trading in the river valleys, and the mages studying in their fungal towers. As the energy passes over them, the physical bodies of the elves undergo an immediate and permanent alteration. Their bright golden skin darkens to the deep grey color of volcanic ash. The white irises of their eyes turn to a solid, glowing red. The elven warriors drop their bone swords and look at their hands, watching their skin change color in the falling snow. Inside the chamber, Sotha Sil and Almalexia look at their own hands and see the same grey ash color spreading across their skin. Vivek holds up his hands and uses his newly acquired magical power to halt the physical transformation halfway across his body. The right side of his face and torso retains the bright gold skin of the original elves, while the left side darkens to the grey ash color of the newly created race. The three floating gods look back at Azura. Sotha Sil speaks, claiming this new physical appearance perfectly matches the volcanic landscape of their home. Azura lowers her hands, states that this grey skin will forever mark their broken oath, and dissolves back into a cloud of silver dust. The three new gods, now known as the Tribunal, float up the stone steps and push open the brass doors of the citadel. They present themselves to the gathered warriors on the slopes of Red Mountain. The grey-skinned elves, now calling themselves the Dunmer, drop to their knees in the dirt and bow their heads. Almalexia projects her voice across the ash fields, commanding the Dunmer to abandon their ancient ancestor worship and build new temples dedicated to the Tribunal. The Dunmer follow these commands. They march back to their settlements and use iron chisels to break the shrines of the Daedric princes into rubble. They quarry blocks of dark sandstone and construct massive stepped pyramids with high wooden doors. Inside these pyramids, the Dunmer light braziers of burning pitch and paint frescoes of Almalexia, Sotha Sil, and Vivek on the walls, using crushed red clay and black charcoal. The Tribunal take up residence in their own capital cities, sitting on hovering thrones of polished obsidian and ruling the eastern province through direct physical presence and overwhelming magical force. The ash from Red Mountain gradually settles into the soil, and the long winter caused by the eruption gives way to warmer seasons. The scribes in the eastern cities update their ledgers with the new name of their race and the new structure of their religion. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the continent, the western ocean currents carry a massive fleet of wooden ships toward the rocky shores of Volenfell. These ships feature tall masts, broad canvas sails, and hulls built from dense island timber. Thousands of dark-skinned warriors stand on the wooden decks, holding curved steel swords and looking at the barren deserts of the Tamrielic coastline, preparing to drive their heavy boots into the sand. The heavy wooden galleons of the Yokudan fleet crash through the waves of the Abessian Sea, driving their prows into the sandy beaches of Tamriel's western coastline. The warriors leaping from the decks call themselves the Ra Garda. They wear loose turbans of white linen to block the sun and wrap their chests in tight bands of cured leather. Their skin shares the dark brown color of polished mahogany, and they wield heavy, single-edged curved swords forged from a dense, star-patterned steel. The Ra Garda push onto the beaches, their leather sandals sinking into the wet sand. They do not send diplomats to the local settlements, and they do not carry trade goods in their holds. They attack the coastal villages immediately, swinging their curved swords and cutting down the local Breton fishermen and the Nedic farmers. They burn the thatched roofs of the wooden houses and tear down the stone docks, claiming the entire western desert region for their own. The native goblins of the region form large war bands to repel the invaders. The goblins stand 4 feet tall, covered in coarse green skin and wielding crude iron spears. They rush out of the rocky canyons, screeching loudly and throwing heavy stones at the Yokudan lines. The Ra Garda respond with absolute military precision. The human swordsmen form tight circular formations, raising their steel blades and stepping forward in perfect rhythm. The curved swords slice through the wooden shafts of the goblin spears and cut deep into the green flesh of the defenders. The Rhaagada systematically clear the canyons, pushing the goblin tribes deep into the underground caves and sealing the entrances with heavy boulders. As the Rhaagada establish their foothold, a second wave of ships arrives from their sinking homeland across the Western Ocean. The Yokudan nobility, known as the Na Totambu, disembark onto the secured beaches. They wear long robes of embroidered silk and carry staffs of polished ebony wood. The nobles direct the Rhaagada warriors to quarry blocks of yellow sandstone from the desert cliffs. The warriors stack the heavy stones to build massive cities with high domed roofs and tall, slender minarets. They construct open-air markets covered by wide canvas awnings and dig deep wells to access the underground aquifers. The Yokudans name their new province Hammerfell. They bring their own horses, large and fast, and breed them in wide wooden corrals. They construct heavy stone temples dedicated to their own gods, entirely ignoring the 8 divines worshipped by the Alessian Empire in the east. The Rhaagada continue to push inland, claiming the sandy plains of the Alika Desert and forcing the native populations to retreat into the Dragontail Mountains. The Breton kingdoms of High Rock attempt to halt the Yokudan expansion. The Bretons march south in heavy chainmail, carrying long iron halberds. The 2 human armies clash near the border. The Breton halberds hook onto the leather armor of the Rhaagada, pulling the desert warriors to the ground. The Yokudans counter by fighting in highly mobile skirmish lines, using their curved swords to parry the heavy iron weapons and strike at the unprotected joints of the Breton armor. The Colovian kings of the Cyrodiilic Empire also send contingents of heavy cavalry to test the strength of the new arrivals. The Colovian horses charge across the flat desert, their hooves kicking up clouds of yellow sand. The Rhaagada archers fire volleys of steel-tipped arrows into the charging horses, dropping the animals and swarming the armored riders with their curved blades. The Rhaagada secure their borders through these continuous physical engagements. They refuse to negotiate with the surrounding provinces, isolating themselves behind their sandstone walls and focusing entirely on expanding their own cities. The scribes in the imperial city dip their quills into the ink and record the presence of this new, hostile human nation on the western edge of the continent. While the Yokudans build their domes in the western deserts, the Alessian Order continues to dominate the central province of Cyrodiil. The grey-robed priests walk through the streets of the capital, holding their wooden staves and striking the cobblestones. They command the citizens to tear down the remaining marble statues and replace them with plain granite blocks. The priests sit in the lower levels of the white gold tower, stacking massive piles of parchment and writing new religious edicts to control the daily actions of the empire. They dip their quills into the black ink and prepare to target the elven populations living beyond their borders, specifically looking toward the thick green canopy of Valenwood and the independent Camoran dynasty. The massive wooden ships of the Yokudan fleet drop heavy iron anchors into the shallow waters off the western coast. The warriors of the Rhaagada step off the wooden gangplanks, their leather sandals sinking into the wet sand. They carry curved swords forged from a distinct, folded steel that holds a razor-sharp edge. The Yokudans wear loose turbans of white linen to protect their heads from the sun and wrap their chests in thick leather harnesses. They look at the rocky canyons and the sparse scrub brush covering the Tamrielic coastline, gripping the hilts of their weapons tightly. The Ra Garda do not carry diplomatic scrolls or chests of trade goods. They immediately begin marching inland, forming tight circular formations. The native goblins of the region, standing only 4 feet tall and covered in coarse green skin, rush out of the sandstone canyons. The goblins screech loudly and throw heavy rocks and crude iron spears at the human invaders. The Yokudan swordsmen step forward in unison, swinging their curved blades to deflect the thrown stones and slice through the wooden shafts of the spears. They cut down the goblins, leaving green blood staining the yellow sand, and push the surviving tribes deep into the underground cave systems. A second wave of ships arrives from the sinking continent of Yokuda. The nobility, known as the Na Totambu, walk down the gangplanks, wearing robes of embroidered silk and carrying long staffs of polished ebony wood. They direct the Ra Garda warriors to quarry blocks of yellow sandstone from the desert cliffs. The human laborers stack the heavy stones to build massive cities featuring high domed roofs and tall, narrow minarets. They construct open-air markets with wide canvas awnings and dig deep circular wells to access the underground aquifers. The Yokudans breed large, fast horses in wide wooden corrals, feeding them dried desert grass. They build heavy stone temples dedicated to their own pantheon of gods, ignoring the 8 divines worshipped in the east. The Ra Garda continue to push inland, claiming the sandy plains of the Alika Desert, and naming their new province Hammerfell. The Breton kingdoms to the north attempt to halt this expansion. Breton infantry march south in heavy chainmail, carrying long iron halberds to pull the desert warriors from their fast horses. The Yokudans fight in highly mobile skirmish lines, using their curved swords to parry the heavy iron halberds and strike at the unprotected joints of the Breton armor. The Colovian kings from Cyrodiil send heavy cavalry across the flat desert, their horses kicking up clouds of sand. The Ra Garda archers fire volleys of steel-tipped arrows into the charging horses, dropping the animals and swarming the armored riders with their curved blades. The Ra Garda secure their borders through these continuous physical engagements, refusing to negotiate with the surrounding provinces. They isolate themselves behind their sandstone walls, focusing entirely on expanding their own cities and establishing their distinct human culture in the western desert. While the Yokudans build their domes in Hammerfell, a massive physical disaster strikes the central province of Cyrodiil. In the year 1E 2260, a sickness called the Thracian Plague spreads through the human and elven populations. The disease originates from the coral kingdoms of the Slode, a race of amphibious beastmen living in the Abyssinian Sea. The Slode use dark necromantic magic to brew the plague in large iron cauldrons, releasing the infected spores into the ocean currents. The plague causes painful, weeping sores to form across the skin of its victims. The infected individuals cough up blood and collapse in the dirt streets of the imperial city. The grey-robed priests of the Alessian order try to cure the sickness with their chanting and their iron-tipped walking sticks, but the disease continues to spread. The death toll rises so quickly that the gravediggers cannot dig holes fast enough. Bodies pile up in the alleyways, covered in white sheets and smelling of rot. Half the population of the Iliac Bay perishes, and the disease cuts deeply into the numbers of the Cyrodiilic Empire. The rulers of Tamriel look at the piles of bodies and decide to act. King Bendu Olo of Anvil, a Colovian king wearing a heavy iron crown, calls a war council in his stone keep. He invites the kings of High Rock, the Ra Garda warlords of Hammerfell, and the remaining Ayleid lords to join him. They sit around a large oak table, pushing aside their political differences to form the All Flags Navy. Thousands of shipwrights work in the coastal ports, cutting down pine trees and shaping heavy timber planks to build a massive fleet of warships. They attach thick bronze rams to the front of the ships and load heavy iron ballistae onto the wooden decks. The combined armies of Tamriel board the ships and sail west across the Abyssinian Sea. They locate the coral kingdom of Thrace, a collection of jagged reefs and submerged stone towers. The All Flags Navy bombards the coral towers with heavy iron bolts. The human and elven warriors jump into the shallow water, swinging their battle axes and glass swords at the soft, blubbery bodies of the Slode. The magic of the Slode necromancers fails to stop the overwhelming numbers of the united fleet. The warriors of Tamriel crush the Slode under their heavy boots, sink the coral structures into the deep ocean trenches, and pour salt and burning pitch over the remaining islands to ensure the beastmen cannot return. The surviving ships sail back to the mainland, leaving the ruined kingdom of Thrace to sink beneath the waves. King Bendu Ollo sits at the head of the heavy oak table in the War Council of Anvil, pressing a piece of black charcoal against a rolled map of the Western Ocean. He draws a series of specific nautical paths leading away from the sunken ruins of Thrace. He points to the Colovian generals and the Ra Garda warlords standing around the room, issuing orders to divide the returning All Flags Navy into separate squadrons. The human leaders pack their sea chests, pull the thick canvas sails taut on their galleons, and steer their ships back toward the mainland ports, carrying the spoils of the destroyed Slode kingdom in their cargo holds. Sirabane, a powerful Aldmeri warlock, travels with one of the returning fleets. He wears layered silk robes and carries a staff of smooth white ivory. He stands on the wooden deck of his galleon, holding a curved ring of meteoric glass, known as the Warlock's Ring. The glass ring pulses with a bright blue light, catching the salt spray from the ocean waves. As the fleet approaches the western coast of Tamriel, Sirabane raises the ring toward the sky, channeling his magic through the glass. He casts a massive spell that stretches across the water and over the land, curing the physical symptoms of the Thracian plague in the surviving populations and breaking the hold of the disease on the continent. While Sirabane casts his healing spell, the remaining ships of the All Flags Navy anchor in the deep harbor of the Somerset Isles. A young Colovian naval officer named Reman Cyrodiil stands on the deck of a heavy warship, looking out at the tall crystal towers of the Altmer. Reman wears a breastplate of hammered iron and carries a broad steel sword. He watches the elven dockworkers unload the captured Slode treasures, taking mental notes on the physical layout of the Altmeri ports and the construction of their sleek, fast-sailing vessels. Decades pass, and the survivors of the Thracian plague rebuild their shattered cities. Reman Cyrodiil leaves the Western Ocean and marches his personal legion of heavily armored Colovian troops toward the center of the continent. They walk down the dirt roads of the Nibonai Valley, finding the capital city deeply fractured. The grey-robed priests of the Alessian Order sit on the stone steps of the White Gold Tower, arguing loudly with the local Nedic warlords over the distribution of grain and the collection of silver taxes. The Colovian estates to the west remain entirely independent, refusing to send their cavalry or their gold to support the failing Eastern priesthood. The empire established by Alessia teeters on the edge of total collapse, completely unable to project physical power beyond the limestone walls of the imperial city. Reman Cyrodiil rides his heavy warhorse into the center of the market square. He raises his steel sword and shouts orders to his Colovian infantry. The armored soldiers push the grey-robed priests away from the white gold tower with their iron shields. Riemann climbs the marble steps and enters the central throne room. He looks at the squabbling warlords, points his sword at the high seat, and declares himself the Emperor of Cyrodiil. He does not wear the ragged wool tunics of the Alessian priests, choosing instead to clad himself in the heavy steel armor of the Western kings. To solidify his rule, Riemann marches his unified armies outward from the capital. He forces the Colovian kings to integrate their archers and heavy cavalry into his new imperial legions. He builds massive stone fortresses at the key mountain passes, placing tall iron gates across the roads to monitor all trade and military movement. The scribes in the capital open fresh ledgers and write the name of the Second Empire at the top of the parchment pages. As Riemann secures the central province, a new physical threat emerges from the northern borders. In the year 1E 2703, the Akaviri, a race of human warriors from the eastern continent, launch a massive invasion of Tamriel. They sail across the Padomaic Ocean in sleek, black-hulled longships and land on the frozen beaches of northern Skyrim. The Akaviri warriors wear armor constructed from overlapping plates of lacquered wood and steel, tied together with thick red silk cords. They carry long, slightly curved swords called katanas, gripping the wrapped handles with both hands to deliver rapid, precise strikes. The Akaviri cut a path through the pine forests of Skyrim, marching southward toward the Jaral Mountains. They swing their katanas, slicing through the heavy iron axes and the wooden shields of the Nordic defenders. The northern Jarls retreat into their mead halls, barring the heavy timber doors as the Akaviri burn the palisades and claim the snowy valleys. Emperor Riemann Cyrodiil receives the reports of the invasion from his scouts. He straps on his steel breastplate, mounts his warhorse, and orders his legions to march north. The imperial army climbs the steep, rocky paths of the Pale Pass, pulling their supply carts through the snowdrifts. They reach the high mountain ridges and form defensive lines of overlapping shields and sharpened spears, waiting in the freezing wind for the Akaviri longswordsmen to emerge from the northern tree line. The Akaviri longswordsmen walk through the heavy snow of the Pale Pass, holding their steel katanas. Their lacquered wood armor clatters as they step over the frozen bodies of the Nordic defenders. Emperor Riemann Cyrodiil waits at the top of the pass, sitting on his armored warhorse. He raises his steel sword and shouts a command in the Cyrodiilic tongue. The imperial heavy infantry step forward, locking their rectangular iron shields together to form a solid wall across the narrow mountain path. The Akaviri charge, bringing their katanas down against the iron shields. The curved steel blades slide off the flat metal surfaces, unable to find purchase in the heavy armor. Riemann drives his horse through the center of the shield wall, swinging his broadsword. The heavy iron horseshoes crush the lacquered wood armor of the Akaviri soldiers. The Colovian cavalry follows him, their long spears piercing the red silk cords of the eastern invaders. The imperial archers fire volleys of iron-tipped arrows from the ridges above, pinning the Akaviri forces in the narrow ravine. The snow turns deep red as the two human armies clash in the freezing wind. During the melee, an Akaviri commander steps out of the formation. He wears a heavy mask forged from black iron, depicting the snarling face of a demon. He looks at Riemann Cyrodiil sitting on his warhorse, listening to the emperor shout commands in the thick Cyrodiilic language. The Akaviri commander drops his katana into the snow. He falls to his knees, pressing his bare hands into the slush, and bows his head. The surrounding Akaviri soldiers follow his lead, dropping their weapons and kneeling in the red snow. Riemann lowers his sword and rides his horse toward the kneeling commander. Through translators, the Akaviri explain that they crossed the ocean not merely to conquer, but to find the Dragonborn, a prophesied ruler carrying the blood of dragons. Hearing Riemann's voice, which possesses a deep, resonating quality unlike normal human speech, the Akaviri swear complete fealty to the new emperor. They pledge their entire army to his service, offering their skills as elite guards and tacticians. Riemann accepts their submission. He orders the Akaviri soldiers to march south into Cyrodiil. He places the eastern warriors in positions of high authority within his new empire. The Akaviri remove their lacquered wood armor and don the heavy steel breastplates of the imperial legions. They train the Colovian recruits in the use of the katana, establishing a new martial tradition within the capital. The Akaviri commanders build a large stone fortress in the Jural Mountains, naming it Cloud Ruler Temple, to serve as the headquarters for the newly formed Dragon Guard, an elite unit dedicated entirely to protecting the emperor. With the Akaviri integrated into his military, Riemann expands the borders of the Second Empire outward. The imperial legions march back into High Rock, carrying the red diamond banner. The Direni elves, heavily weakened from their previous wars, abandon their remaining coastal cities and retreat entirely to the Isle of Balfiera. The human Bretons take control of the northern province, opening their iron gates to the imperial generals and swearing fealty to the Ruby Throne. The legions move west into Hammerfell, negotiating trade treaties with the Ra-Garda warlords and securing the sandy borders. In the eastern province of Morrowind, the tribunal look out from their obsidian thrones. The grey-skinned Dunmer build their stepped pyramids and mine the basalt quarries, but the imperial legions do not cross the Velothi Mountains. Riemann Cyrodiil focuses on consolidating his physical control over the western and central provinces, leaving the glowing red eyes of the living gods to watch the ash plains undisturbed. Decades turn into centuries, and the descendants of Riemann Cyrodiil continue to wear the heavy gold crown. The imperial city expands outward from the white gold tower, filling the surrounding islands with stone houses, wide cobblestone avenues, and bustling markets. Ships with white canvas sails carry goods from every province into the deep harbor, unloading crates of salt, bundles of silk, and bars of refined iron. The Akaviri Dragon Guard stand on the marble steps of the palace, holding their long katanas and watching the crowds. In the year 1E 2920, the longest recorded era finally reaches its conclusion. An assassin steps out of the shadows in the imperial city, holding a short blade coated in black poison. He drives the dagger into the chest of Emperor Riemann III. The emperor falls onto the cobblestones, blood pooling beneath his steel breastplate. The assassin pulls the blade free and disappears into the alleyways. The Dragon Guard rush forward, but they are too late to stop the poison from spreading. The last emperor of the Riemann dynasty stops breathing on the stone street. The red diamond of the Amulet of Kings grows cold against his chest. An Akaviri potentate named Versidue Shire steps forward, picks up the bloody crown, and declares the end of the First Era. Scribes across Tamriel close their thick leather ledgers, place their quills on their desks, and prepare fresh parchment to record the first physical actions of a completely new age. Versidue Shire sits on the ruby throne inside the white gold tower, pressing his scaled hands against the carved armrests. His physical form differs entirely from the elven kings and human emperors who previously occupied the seat. He possesses the long, coiled body of a serpent, covered in tightly overlapping gold and green scales. He wears a breastplate of polished steel, modified to fit his serpentine torso, and grips a long katana in his right hand. The Akaviri potentate dictates new laws directly to the human scribes sitting at the base of the marble steps. The scribes write the year 2E1 at the top of their ledgers. They draw a thick black line across the bottom of the previous scroll, officially closing the records of the First Era. They bundle the thousands of parchment pages detailing the rise of the Aleid Empire, the slave rebellion of Alesia, the disappearance of the Dwemer, and the Colovian conquests into thick leather bindings. The scribes carry these heavy books down into the deep subterranean vaults beneath the imperial city, placing them on iron shelves alongside the records of the Sijic monks and the Direni lords. The First Era leaves a permanent physical mark on the continent of Tamriel. The Aleid cities stand in ruins throughout the Cyrodiilic jungle, their white limestone walls cracked and covered in thick green moss. The broken pieces of the blue Welkind stones still glow faintly in the mud, half buried under the roots of the massive oak trees. The bronze automatons of the Dwemer sit motionless on the ash slopes of Red Mountain, their gears rusted and their steam pipes cold. The sandstone minarets of the Yokudans cast long shadows across the Alika desert, standing as firm borders against the Breton kingdoms of High Rock. The architectural styles blend together in the central province. The imperial city features the tall white spires built by elven masons, surrounded by the heavy stone walls and iron gates, constructed by Colovian engineers. The Akaviri Dragon Guard walk the parapets, their red silk cords and lacquered wood armor standing out against the grey granite. The human citizens walk through the markets, speaking a common tongue and spending silver coins stamped with the profile of the first emperor. The religious practices shift into their final forms. In the eastern province of Morrowind, the grey-skinned Dunmer kneel before the stepped pyramids, burning pitch and reciting prayers to the living gods of the tribunal. In the central province, human priests tend the fires in the 8 bronze braziers, upholding the pantheon established by Alesia. The massive red diamond of the Amulet of Kings rests inside a locked iron chest in the deepest vault of the White Gold Tower, waiting for a new human ruler with the blood of dragons to place the gold chain around their neck. Versidue Shai slithers down the marble steps of the throne room. His scaled tail scrapes against the smooth stone, leaving a faint trail of dust. He walks out into the central courtyard, looking at the tall bronze brazier. The orange flames of the dragonfires are extinguished. The air above the city is still, showing no signs of magical distortion. The portals of oblivion remain closed, but the physical barrier between the realms relies entirely on the cold red gem resting in the vault below. The potentate raises his katana and points the sharp steel blade toward the eastern borders. He commands his imperial legions to march out of the city gates, intending to bring the final independent province under the direct control of the Ruby Throne. The heavy boots of the Colovian infantry and the swift horses of the Ra-Garda cavalry move across the cobblestone roads, carrying the steel weapons and the military strategies forged during the First Era into the conflicts of the Second. The scribes sit back down at their wooden desks, dip their quills into the ink, and begin recording the next long sequence of wars, alliances, and fallen kingdoms. The end of the First Era comes with the closing of the ledger in the imperial city, completing the specific sequence of 2,920 years. The scribes slide the final heavy, leather-bound book onto the lower shelf in the subterranean vault. They extinguish their wax candles, leaving the archives in darkness. The new era begins with a scaled potentate, sitting on a human throne, commanding armies composed of Nedic swordsmen, Colovian archers, and Akaviri longswordsmen. You look at the physical changes written across these 3,000 years. The elves no longer whip human slaves on the muddy banks of the Neban River. The Ayleid cities are empty, covered entirely in green vines. The Dwemer anvils remain cold, their bronze machines standing motionless in the grey ash of Red Mountain. Men now wear the heavy iron crowns in Cyrodiil and High Rock, building thick stone walls around their settlements and forging steel blades in their own foundries. These events are completely recorded in ink and parchment, stored deep below the polished marble floors of the white gold tower. As you lie beneath the warm furs, let the fire in the hearth burn down to a dull red glow. The long walk through the First Era is over. The frost rests on the window panes, and the night sky is clear. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and prepare for the quiet hours ahead. May your road lead you to warm sands,